I've been playing live poker successfully for around 10 years, first as an amateur, later as a semi-professional. I've also been a live poker coach for 2 years, helping dozens of players from around the world to improve their results at 1-2 and 1-3 live. And I've had an educational YouTube channel about poker with a total of well over 1 million views. But here's the thing. I don't want your success at the live poker tables to take 10 years. You can improve much faster. That's why I've compiled everything I've learned into this one video. Inside, I'll take you behind the scenes. How I play pre-flop and post-flop. How my thinking process goes on every street. What hacks to use to exploit your recreational opponents. You're going to learn to be more efficient. You'll see mistakes you must avoid at all costs. You'll understand how to master the foundations and how to deal with donk bets, how to approach 3-bet pots and c-betting, and what strategy to use in deep stack poker. I'm calling this 1-2 and 1-3 University. It's everything you need. But remember, none of it will work if you don't fully commit and master each lesson. We'll start with some of the biggest mistakes I see all the time and that are very costly. So sit back, relax, and learn how to crush your local 1-2 and 1-3 live games.
Are you tired of barely breaking even in your local cash games? And have you ever felt like you're the best player at the table, but you still can't seem to leave a consistent winner? Let's fix that today. If you're still struggling to beat low stakes, it's probably because you're ignoring these key strategies. That's why today we're going to talk about the 10 most likely reasons why you don't beat the low stakes poker games in your casino. My name is Andreas Wagner. I'm a live poker coach who has helped over a dozen players to achieve their goals on the felt. And today you'll get one step closer to finally becoming a bigger winner at 1-2 or 1-3 live. The first reason why most ambitious low-stakes players don't achieve the win rate that they would like is simply a lack of attention. A while ago I was playing in my local 1-2 game with a friend who isn't happy with his hourly rate. After a few minutes at the table, the following hand developed. An early position player limped, the cutoff raised to 10, the big blind called, and the limper called. I was in the low jack and I folded my 9-deuce offsuit. My friend was under the gun +1, he also folded pre-flop. The flop in the hand was 10-3 deuce rainbow. The big blind checked, the limper now bet 20, only the cutoff called. The turn was a 7 that brought in a flush draw. The limper now bet 75 into the pot of 70, cutoff folds. The limper shows pocket tens for top set. What does that tell us? Well, the guy limped a hand as strong as pocket tens, then donked with top set, and then overbet when he still had the nuts, but the board got wetter. Okay. 20 minutes later, this same guy now raises to 15 pre-flop. My friend called the bet. Everyone else folded. The flop came king 6-4. The original raiser Cbet big. My friend called. The turn was a jack that brought in the flush draw. The guy in early position now overbet again, and my friend called again. The river brought the backdoor flush. Both players checked. The guy in early position, unsurprisingly, turns over pocket kings for top set. My friend mucked and told me later that he had king-queen. To me, it was obvious that the early position player had a huge hand. After he limped pocket tens, I thought he must have at least something like pocket queens. And once he bet so big on the flop and on the turn, it was clear to me again that he must have a huge hand. But this wasn't clear to my friend. Why not? Is he so bad when it comes to reading players? Well, he would have drawn the same conclusion as me if he had only paid attention. But he didn't. When the previous hand was being played, he was texting someone on his phone and totally missed what was going on. And that is exactly the first reason why so many players have a much worse win rate than they would like. They don't pay attention to key information about players' tendencies. The next one is an absolute classic, but it is still relevant even in 2025. If you're guilty of this one, then you will basically have no chance of being a big winner at low stakes. Look at this example. You raise pocket fives, the button and the big blind call. Both are passive recreational players. You flop a set on Jack 9-5 with two hearts, you c-bet big, and only the button calls. The turn is a brick. You c-bet big again, he calls again. The river is the king of hearts. You are disgusted and check. Villain now bets 3/4 pot. You have a feeling that you might be beat, but you still call, well, because you have a set. Villain turns over a flush and you lose. So what went wrong here? You played pre-flop, flop, and turn perfectly. The check on the river was fine, but once Villain bets, this is a clear fold at live low stakes. And yes, I'm aware that Hero has a set, but the problem is that we filtered heavily until the river, and when the flush comes in, our hand gets downgraded to a bluff catcher. If you have Queen Jack or a set of fives, it's pretty much the same hand in this spot. Both are nothing but a bluff catcher. Yes, once in a blue moon, Villain will overvalue two pair, but a recreational player will rarely put in so much money on the river once the flush completes. Remember, we said Hero was disgusted by the flush completing card. If Villain had two pair, he would have been equally disgusted. So the only hand class we beat is a pure bluff. And now tell me one hand that's a bluff on this board after we bet the flop and the turn big. I can't think of any. So the second reason why you don't beat live low stakes poker is because you get married to big hands and bluff catch in super under bluffed spots. The third one is not as obvious because you only lose small pots, but these can add up. Here is a classic example. Villain raises in middle position, you call on the button with Queen Jack of spades. Normally, I would not recommend cold calling on the button, but let's assume that the blinds are really weak passive players and you were hoping they join the party. But you go heads up to a flop of 8-5 deuce with two diamonds and a heart. Villain c-bets half pot. You completely miss this flop, so should you just fold? It depends on the opponent, but this is most likely a range bet like we see them all the time in live poker. Some players would fire a bet into 5 opponents with king high just because they raised pre-flop. Folding here is not terrible in the theoretical sense, but against an opponent who just throws out lazy c-bets every time he raises pre-flop, this would be a blunder. Instead, either raise or call and then take it away later in the hand. So the third reason why you don't beat live low stakes poker is because you don't attack lazy range bets. The examples so far have been mainly for heads up pots, but we'll move to multi-way pots soon, promise. But this next one is a cousin of the lazy range bet, kind of. Say Villain raises in late position and you call in the big blind with king 10 suited. The flop is ace 8-4 with a flush draw. You check and your opponent, who is a recreational player, checks behind. If two good players are in this spot, the late position raiser is meant to protect their checking range by throwing some hands like ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10, and many lower aces into their checking range. Even two pair are meant to be checked sometimes. But do you think that a typical recreational player at 1-2 or 1-3 will check back a good ace or better when there is a flush draw out there? I doubt it. Recreational players are notoriously bad at protecting their checking ranges on the driest of boards, let alone on wet boards like in this example. Since they also tend to c-bet too much with junk and draws, the most likely type of hand Villain has in this spot is some sort of showdown value. This could be a weak ace, pocket kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines. So if the turn card is a break, I would start putting pressure on all those hands. I would overbet the turn. Solvers even go 2.5 times the pot with a hand like 7-6. This will probably get the job done. But you can also just go with a small overbet and then take out the big hammer on the river. He will still most likely fold his bluff catchers. And you will win even more because you win the money he paid on the turn. But what do most players do instead? They check their king high on the turn because they have showdown value. So the fourth reason why you don't beat live low stakes poker is because you don't punish checking ranges. Now let's look at some examples in multi-way pots. You're in the big blind with king jack offsuit. There's a limp in your position, two players call, hijack makes it 10, cutoff and button call. This pot is certain to go super multi-way unless you squeeze here. And oh boy, I would squeeze all day in this spot because the hijack only made it 10 over 3 limpers. That just doesn't scream like a big hand. Make it 70 and you will probably pick up the pot uncontested. But instead, most players call here. And the limpers also call, so we're seeing a flop 7 ways. If I had a hand like pocket fours or ace-2 suited, I would absolutely call in this spot, even though the raise was to $10. But king-jack offsuit plays terribly in multi-way pots. Imagine the flop comes king 9-5 rainbow and a lot of money goes into the pot. Do you ever feel confident with your top pair? Even if the flop is king jack 5, I wouldn't want to call an all-in on the flop in a pot against 6 players. And this is reason number 5 why you don't beat live low-stakes poker. You play the wrong hands in multi-way pots. The only hands I really like in multi-way pots are pocket pairs and suited aces, potentially some suited broadways. Continuing with our multi-way pot theme, here's an example of a hand I witnessed at 1-2. A guy raised his pocket nines to 10 and got 4 corners. The flop came ace-9-4 rainbow. The board is as dry as it could be, so our hero decided to be tricky and check. Sadly for him, it checked through. When the 10 of hearts brought in a flush draw and a straight draw, he finally started betting. 2 players called. The river completed the flush, so our hero now slowed down and checked again. The other 2 players checked behind. Hero won the pot with his set of nines, of course. One of the villains showed ace-jack, the other one showed ace-5. Hero won the minimum in this hand. Why is that? Sure, the run-out was not great for him, but that is only a small part of the problem. He sandbagged his middle set when 2 other players had an ace. They too didn't bet their top pair because they were afraid of someone else having a better hand. So the issue in this hand was that hero slow played in the wrong spot. And this hero made one more mistake in this hand, and that leads us to reason number 7 why you don't beat the low stakes. And I can tell you, if you're guilty of this one, you won't beat the game for a significant amount of money. So let's look at the river decision in this hand. I bet hero would have called a river bet after his check, but you see, the players with their respective aces did not bet the river. They would also be terrified that someone could have the flush. So if they bet this river, they would most likely do it with a flush. Maybe once in a blue moon, one of them would bluff the river, but there are not many bluffs available except maybe some straight draws. But even then, they must have it in them to bluff 2 opponents for a fairly big amount of money. If hero decides to check call on this river, he will therefore most likely lose money. And this is where I like another move much better. Bet this river small yourself. It is very unlikely that you will get raised as a bluff after you bet. It is quite an ask from a recreational 1-2 player to bluff the river if everyone checks, and it is an even bigger ask to then raise as a bluff. A good player might turn his ace into a bluff once he realizes that you probably don't have a flush when you bet small, but your typical opponent at 1-2 will not turn their top pair into a bluff. But at least one of these 2 players would most likely have called a small river bet. And sure, if one of them has a flush, he might raise, but then you can just fold. If they only have a 7-high flush, they might just call your small bet anyway. So, the 7th reason why you don't beat live low-stakes poker is because you don't bet thinly enough for value. This next one is a more conceptual thing, but it shows very well why some players are stuck. Imagine walking into a casino and sitting down at a table where most players are either strong regulars or ultra-tight knits. The atmosphere is silent, everyone is serious, and raise sizes come straight out of a game theory optimal GTO playbook. Across the room, you notice another table filled with laughter, loose play, and constant all-ins being announced. Which table would you rather be at? The answer seems obvious, the second table, of course. Yet many players don't fully understand just how significant this choice is for their win rate. Let's break it down with an example. At the first table, let's assume there are 8 players, 5 of whom are solid regulars, each earning an hourly rate of $15. Two tight players barely break even, and there's only one losing player who gives away about $20 per hour. The total rate for the table is around $80 an hour. With only one losing player, the remaining 7 players must essentially cover the cost of the rake. In this scenario, even the best player at the table could end up losing money simply because there isn't enough to win. Now consider the second table. Here you have 2 top pros, 1 good reg, 3 slightly losing players, and 2 big whales who lose $100 per hour each. The total rake is higher due to the loose action, say $100 per hour. So one of the whales alone covers the rake. The other whale and the 3 slightly losing players provide an additional $115 to be distributed among the pros and the reg. The profit potential at this table is so much higher. And quite frankly, if you play at that first table, you cannot beat it. You cannot beat the rake. So why would anyone in their right mind not ask for a table change? I guess it's laziness or inertia, but whatever it is, you don't beat the game if you don't table select well. Poker is a game of value, and value doesn't mean to overpay for the nice and shiny things, but always check whether you pay a good price for what you get. In some cases, it is obvious that you are getting ripped off. For example, if you hold 7 deuce offsuit and someone raises to, say, 50 big blinds. And conversely, if you have aces and someone raises to 50 big blinds, then you're getting amazing value there. But there are a lot of in-between situations that players either miss or they have a bias that makes them play a hand in a certain spot although they know better. One such situation is if a villain in a 1-2 game opens to $15 in the cutoff. You're in the big blind with pocket sixes. This is like being offered a really juicy pizza, but then you're told that you have to pay $75 for it. Sometimes you might really want that pizza in that moment, so you will buy it even though you know you're getting ripped off. And the same is true for the pocket sixes in this hand. It seems silly to fold this hand to just one pre-flop bet. But if you call in this spot, you have to ask yourself, how can I make money with this? Well, the easiest way to make money would be to flop a set. But then villain would either have to have a fairly big hand himself, or he would have to be a complete maniac who blasts off his entire stack with air. But let's say he's a normal, somewhat timid player, maybe a bit too loose, but doesn't do anything crazy. Well, in this case, there is almost no chance that we will get paid if we flop big. Other ways of making money would be if he checks the hand through and we beat a hand like ace high. But that will have a lot of equity against us on the way, so he might just hit that pair at some point. We could attempt to bluff him, but we are out of position and we have already paid a lot to see the flop. I don't like any of these options, and the reason is simply because he made it $15 pre-flop. Had there been a few more players involved, I would have liked to call and hopefully stack one of them if I hit a set. Had he used a GTO approved size like $5 or $6, I would happily call as well. But for $15, I'm just not getting a good enough price. And yet so many players will call here without even thinking. And this is the reason why they don't beat live low stakes. They are not price sensitive. And the 10th reason why you don't beat the live low stakes has to do with bluffing. There is a myth going around that says that bluffing at the low stakes is not profitable. Well, maybe it isn't the way you do it, but that's because you're doing it wrong. Here's how most players at low stakes go about bluffing if they ever decide to run a bluff. Let's go back to a hand from earlier in this video where villain raised in late position, you called in the big blind with king 10 suited and the flop check through on ace 8-4 with a flush draw. We said earlier that villain's range is very capped, and we said that you need to attack that. Okay, so you pluck up the courage and bet half pot on the turn. Villain calls. On a brick river, you bet half pot again, and he calls with his pocket queens. So what did we do wrong here? It was the size, of course. In deep stack poker, you need to go big. The game is called no limit for a reason. How would you feel with pocket queens on this board if your opponent bet $45 into a pot of 20 and then followed it up with a $180 bet into a pot of 110 on the river? They will feel equally uncomfortable. So if you want bluffs to have a chance of going through at low stakes, you have to make them significant. Because the 10th reason why you don't beat live low stakes poker is because you don't use overbets. If you get better in these 10 spots, your win rate should move up incrementally. Want to take your poker game to the next level? Then you need to stop making these 5 mistakes. If you play 1-2, 1-3 or 2-5 live, I can almost guarantee that you make at least some of them. In fact, every single one of my students has at least some of these leaks, and they are extremely costly. So today I'm going to show you what these 5 leaks are, how you can stop them, and what you should do instead in order to make 2025 the best year of your poker career. Let's jump right into them. The first big leak is a classic that I see all the time, like in this example. Hero opens Jack 10 of spades in late position and gets called by the button. The flop is Ace Jack 4 rainbow. Hero now makes a small c-bet. This is not terrible, although I'd prefer to see a check. Our hand might be good, but we don't really want to invest a lot of money with it. But anyway, we bet and get called. The turn is the 7 of diamonds and brings a flush draw. Hero now bets almost pot, and this is a big mistake. Betting big on the turn is indeed a thing, but the reason why we do that is because we want to polarize on the turn. That means that we want to bet our very best hands and our bluffs. And now tell me which of these two things our hand is. Is Jack 10 one of the best hands we could possibly have in this spot? Certainly not. Is it a complete bluff where we hope to get villain to fold some marginal hand? No, because we have some showdown value with our second pair, but it seems unlikely that villain would fold a better hand. It's not impossible that we do get a better hand to fold, but there is no point in risking a pot-sized bet when we have okay showdown value. Whenever you get to the turn as the aggressor, think whether your hand actually accomplishes something when it bets big. So the first thing to stop doing if you want to crush live poker now is stop making polarization mistakes. The second one is also a big favorite of mine, and I've talked about it quite a bit in the last few months. But I'm including it here again because it is such an important thing, and so many players will get it wrong. A student of mine recently complained that he has so many bad beats. I analyzed his game and found out that it was exactly this one leak that led to most of those lost pots that he called bad beats. Here's a typical example of this mistake. There's an early position raise, 2 more players call, Hero has Ace 10 offsuit in the cutoff and calls. Both blinds also call, and we go 6 ways to the flop. The flop is Ace 8 deuce. The original raiser c-bets, 1 player calls, 1 player folds. Hero now calls as well, both blinds get out of the way. The turn is an offsuit queen. The original raiser bets again, the other player calls again, Hero calls behind. The river is a 10, we now have 2 pair. The early position player shoves for his remaining chips. The other player folds. Hero has 2 pair and flicks in the call because we didn't drive to the casino to call Ace 10 offsuit preflop and then fold 2 pair on the river. Villain turns over Ace Queen for better 2 pairs. So what went wrong here? If you're trying to find the answer post-flop or would like to blame bad luck for making us river a worse second pair, then you're on the wrong path. Because the mistake here was clearly pre-flop. Ace-10 offsuit in late position is a really good hand if nobody has put any money into the pot voluntarily. But after an early position raise and 2 calls, this hand is terrible. It has reverse implied odds in case we hit an ace because someone else can have a better ace, as it happened in this example, and it just plays terribly multi-way anyway. You can consider a 3-bet squeezing with this hand, or you can fold, but calling is terrible. Even in heads-up pots, it is never a great idea to call a hand like Ace-10 offsuit, especially not if the raise size was bigger than 2 times the big blind, which is basically always in live poker. And in multi-way pots, this becomes a sin that destroys bankrolls. So the second thing to stop doing if you want to crush live poker is stop calling bets pre-flop. Play a 3-bet or fold strategy only. The next mistake won't seem costly because you usually only lose a small amount of money, but it adds up to a bankroll eater. Say you have Ace-King offsuit in early position and raise to $10 in a 1-2. This raise size is too big, but this is not even the mistake I'm talking about. 4 players call, including the big blind. Now we are 5 ways to a flop of 10-7-5 with 2 spades. Big blind checks and we fire a Cbet of $25 into this pot. Now think for a moment, what does this bet accomplish? Can we get a worse hand to call? Well, maybe some sort of a draw calls, but that would have decent equity against our hand and we are out of position. Is it likely that we can get everyone to fold? I would say absolutely not. It would be a poker miracle if we could get this one through against 4 opponents whose ranges connect very well with this flop. Sure, a low pocket pair might fold, but what about the other players? At least one of them will continue. And then what will we do on the turn? Continue barreling with ace high out of position? Maybe you don't make this exact mistake because you realize that it is silly. But I chose an extreme example on purpose. But the fact is that even in a heads-up pot, such a flop would have to be treated very carefully. And there are loads of players out there who just Cbet every flop against multiple players just because they are the pre-flop aggressor. Don't be that guy. I have just published my new ebook Cbet Mastery. If you want a free copy, just click the link in the description below. After you read that book, you will stop making this third mistake, which is Cbetting every hand. The next one is a really old school play, but many players still do this. It is linked to our first mistake, the polarization error, but with a twist. Here is a common spot where this happens. A player in middle position raises to $10 and our hero calls in the big blind with 9-8 suited. The flop comes Jack 8-3 rainbow. Normal procedure would be to check to the aggressor, but old school players will often donk bet small in this spot. A donk bet is any bet made by a player out of position who was not the aggressor on the previous street. The thinking goes,
I want to find out if my weak pair is good. If villain has an overpair, he will raise me. And if he has ace-king, then I won't get outdrawn if he folds.
This thinking makes kind of sense until you play against a good opponent. He will see right through this play and can apply pressure. But we'll get to that later. First, I'd like to talk about what poker is about. You might say,
Poker is about winning money.
That's not wrong, but at its core, poker is a game where you have to try to avoid mistakes while inducing your opponent to make mistakes. And by donk betting in this exact spot, you allow your opponent to play perfectly. If he has an overpair, you're putting money in for him. If he has nothing, you don't allow him to bluff. Or you allow him to bluff, but then he will raise and you will probably have to fold. And if he has a hand like ace-king, you still give him the odds to catch a pair with his 2 overcards. So there is hardly a way to get him to make a mistake by betting. Here's what to do instead. Check for information. If you check in this spot, you give him the chance to bluff any overcards or other junk that he has. And that is an easy way to let him make a mistake. So the fourth thing to stop doing if you want to crush live poker now is stop betting for information. Instead, check for information. And now to the last one. This is a mindset issue that creeps into so many situations that it paralyzes players, like in this example. We reach the river with a set against a really passive opponent. The flush just completed on the river. We bet the flop and the turn, and he called twice. Now he checks to us. This is a spot where you would have to be very careful against good, strong, tricky opponents. If you bet, they might check raise you both for value and as a bluff, and then you would be in a world of pain. But in our example, we're up against a passive calling station. This type of player will not bluff raise you. But I see so many players just check behind in this spot because they are terrified of getting raised. They are afraid of a scenario that is extremely unlikely to happen. This league can be seen in many different spots. For example, not betting an overpair on the turn because of fear of getting check raised, or not raising Jack-9 suited on the button because the big blind is aggressive and might 3-bet. All these things could indeed happen, but the likelihood of them happening is often much smaller than we think. So the fifth thing to stop doing if you want to crush live poker is stop being worried about things that might never happen. You'll have enough time to worry about them in the unlikely event that you will get raised. If you play live low-stakes poker, I can guarantee that you make this one mistake. How do I know? Because everyone makes it. Recreational players, fish, whales, semi-pros, pros, heck, even poker coaches make this mistake. And because everybody makes the same mistake, nobody really notices it. But if you become the only player in your player pool who avoids this mistake, then your win rate will automatically shoot up. In this video, I'm going to show you what this super common mistake is, why it even is a mistake, and what you can do to separate yourself from everybody else in your games. And then I will also tell you that sometimes it is actually a good thing to make this mistake because you will induce even bigger mistakes from your opponents. My name is Andreas Wagner. I'm a live low-stakes poker player and coach. Let's jump right into it. So what is this mysterious mistake that nobody even notices? Here's an example of it. Say you play in a 1-2 live game at a casino with a typical rake structure. The cutoff raises to $10 and it folds to you in the big blind. You look down at King-Jack offsuit. What do you do in this spot? I'm almost certain that you call. And that is the mistake everybody makes. It probably doesn't seem like much of a mistake to you in this moment. Well, as I said, nobody really notices it because everybody makes this same mistake. And if you look at a solver like GTO Wizard, you can see that in the big blind, you mostly call the cutoff raise with King-Jack offsuit. You sometimes raise and you never fold.
So how is it a mistake then if I call?
You might ask. The solver assumes that the cutoff opened to 2.3 big blinds, which would be $4.60. And it assumes that we are 100 big blinds deep. But in our example, Villain made it 5 times the big blind and we are 200 big blinds deep. And the other thing is rake. Live rake tends to be 10% of the pot up to a cap in most casinos in the US, and in Europe and Asia it is 5% with a higher cap. I have always had a suspicion that I was calling bets too loose in live poker, but now I have confirmation. GTO Wizard's new 8max preflop tool offers this proof. If we look at this exact scenario, we can see that calling King-Jack offsuit in the big blind would indeed be a mistake. And the same is true for low pocket pairs, many suited aces, all suited connectors. Even with pocket nines, you would make a mistake by calling. And now, be honest, would you ever have folded pocket nines in this spot? And here we're talking about a raise to $10. Now imagine if someone raises to $15, which is not that uncommon in many low-stakes games. Calling with King-Jack offsuit becomes an even bigger mistake now. And even pocket 10s and ace 10 suited are losing hands in theory. In GTO Wizard, you can play around with different raise sizes in their 8 max version. Some eye-opening moments are guaranteed. This is like going to the supermarket and buying a liter of milk. If the milk costs $1, you'll be happy to buy it. If it costs $2, well, maybe you would get a better price somewhere else. But if the supermarket charges $8 for that 1 liter, which is like a quarter of a gallon, then you know you're not getting a great deal. Unless you live in Hawaii, of course, then $8 would still be a bargain. And it's the same with poker. You have to be price sensitive. At this point, I would like to add a disclaimer, however. Of course, the solver assumes that your opponents are world class. And of course, the opponents in the games you play are not world class. So we have to take the solver output with a pinch of salt. But I want to show you another example where most players will get it wrong in the real world of live poker. Say it is the same scenario, but we know that the player in the cutoff is not a world-class player, but a normal break-even player at 1-2. He raises to $12 and it folds to us. We now have pocket fours and we call. The flop is amazing. King 8-4 rainbow. Villain Cbets to $12. We only call this time. The turn is a brick. We check and unfortunately he checks back. The river is another brick. We now bet around pot to $50. He side calls with his king queen. We win $75 of our opponent minus a rake, of course. Most players will be quite happy in this spot. But the thing is that we will only flop a set around 12% of the time. So whenever we do hit a set, we have to make 8 times as much as we invest just to break even. That means that whenever we hit a set, we have to make $80 on average. And that's not even accounting for the times when we hit our set, but we still lose the pot because villain has a better set or a straight or a flush. But we invested $10 and we only won $75 minus the rake. So even though we hit a set and our opponent has top pair, we did not make enough money to get a positive return on investment. And this means that calling pocket fours pre-flop to a raise as big as 6 times the big blind was clearly a mistake. But sometimes you have to actually make a mistake to win more money. Let me explain. In poker, you don't make money because of your brilliant plays. In poker, you make money because of the mistakes your opponents make. So if you make a small mistake and therefore induce a bigger mistake from your opponent, your win rate will go up. Here's an example. If you have a hand like King Jack offsuit in the cutoff, you are meant to open it to around 2.3 to 2.5 big blinds. At 1-2, this would mean raising to $5. If you open this exact hand to $15, it would be a mistake in game theory because your opponent can exploit you. But at 1-2, this will probably not happen. Of course, if the big blind wakes up with pocket aces, he will 3-bet you and you will lose more money than necessary. But if the big blind calls your huge raise with, say, Jack-9 offsuit, then his mistake will be much bigger than yours. And you would never have made that big mistake if you hadn't raised to 7.5 big blinds. This is exactly why you should still raise bigger, especially with good hands when you are in late position and you don't expect your opponents to 3-bet you light. But here's the thing. You can rarely induce this sort of mistake by calling a bet, because when you call a big bet, then you will be typically the one making the bigger mistake. There is one exception though, and I want to show it to you now. If you have a pocket pair or potentially a suited connector could also be a good hand for this, and you call an early position raise when you are in late position or in the blinds. Even the solver approves this move. It says that the play is neutral in terms of expected value, but with your skill edge that you hopefully have over your opponent, you can make this a profitable play. At this point, you're mainly hoping to flop a set and then stack an opponent who can't let go of an overpair or top pair. This strategy works very well in multi-way pots too, but be careful with suited connectors. Their value goes down in multi-way pots. If you can see that the pot will go multi-way, I would fold those and add suited aces instead, because they can make the nut flush whereas suited connectors can't. So what should be the right play then? Should we fold more pre-flop or make small mistakes to induce bigger mistakes by our opponent? Well, both, but you have to pick the right spots. Basically, whenever you are out of position, aka you're in the blind, and you face a big raise, I would play a 3-bet or fold strategy only. This is even more true if there was a raise and there were a few callers in between. You can take the pot down straight away and avoid paying rake. Now you will realize your equity even less, so I would definitely fold any hand that doesn't play well in multi-way pots. But as you can see, even in heads-up pots, if someone raises to 7 big blinds, you have virtually 0 calls on any position, including the big blind. And if you're on the button or in the cutoff, and someone opens from early position, you can call with pocket pairs, suited broadways, suited connectors. But be aware that it would not be a mistake to just fold these hands. You are relying on hitting a big hand or bluffing someone off their hand, which can work, but is a risky and potentially expensive strategy. So if you want to play it safer, just always play a 3-bet or fold strategy against big bets.
Imagine playing hundreds of hours of live poker, doing hand history reviews and studying both solvers and exploitative strategies, only to realize that you're breaking even or just about winning peanuts. Sounds familiar? Well, I've been there. I was a break-even player at the beginning of my career, and I remember how frustrating it was. By now, I have become a professional live low-stakes player, and I have identified 5 of the most common leaks that are holding you back. My name is Andreas Wagner, and in this video I'm going to show you exactly what these leaks are and how you too can learn to fix them. And I can tell you, all these leaks are detrimental to your win rate, but especially the last one can be extremely costly. So make sure to watch until the end so that you can plug the leak. The first leak is one that is actually super easy to fix. And I think the average 1-2 and 1-3 player could probably add about $2 to their hourly rate just by not making this mistake, possibly even more. How do I know? Well, let me introduce you to someone. This is Andreas 2015, a young poker player who made this mistake all the time. Okay, I didn't look quite like that, but you get the point. Anyway, this is what Andreas 2015 would have done. He would have opened King-Jack offsuit in early position. That already is a very loose open, given that there are 7 players to act behind me, but it's not the end of the world. But then, the low jack would 3-bet and everybody else would fold. Not so Andreas 2015 though. Do you know what the worst possible option is here? Calling. And that's exactly what Andreas 2015 did. 4-betting is also too loose, but at least you have a chance to take the pot down pre-flop. And if you get called, you have the initiative. But if you call, then one of 2 scenarios are likely to happen. Either you get a flop like this one, villain Cbet, you fold and you lose your investment. Or even worse, you hit top pair, villain double or even triple barrels, you play the guessing game and then you lose an even bigger pot. You might now say,
But Andreas, what if the flop comes King-Jack 5? Then we can stack his aces.
well, yes. First of all, he needs to have aces or ace-king though. And second of all, our chances of hitting 2-pair are 2%. Oh, and third of all, if all we hope for is to flop 2-pair, we might as well do that with 7-deuce offsuit, because our chances of hitting 2-pair with that hand is exactly the same as with King-Jack offsuit. But Andreas 2015 did make that pre-flop call and lost a lot of money. That's why my win rate looked like this in my first year of playing live poker. So reason number 1 why your poker is stuck is you call pre-flop 3-bets way too loose. As I said, it's easy to fix this one. Have a look at solver ranges to see what hands you should call with in theory. And because live players tend to not 3-bet bluff enough, you can actually even call a bit tighter against most players. But off to the next league, and this one also starts already pre-flop. You open pocket jacks in early position, cut off and button call, and a recreational player squeezes in the big blind. Even in theory, this is a mix between call and fold, but the theory assumes two things. One, that we open to 2x and therefore the squeeze size is 14, but notice we open much bigger and so we are getting a worse price to call. And two, it assumes that the big blind has some bluffs in their balanced range. A typical recreational player usually doesn't have a balanced range in this spot though. So we can assume that his range is skewed towards big pocket pairs and ace-king. But calling is not a disaster, but I'm telling you what is a disaster, and that's the post-flop play. The flop comes 7-5 deuce rainbow. He now c-bets big. I think once you get to this point, you have to peel once. But when the turn is another low card and he now barrels again, you are almost always beat. And if you don't fold this turn, you're burning money. But our hero in this hand can't let go of his top pair. When the river is a low card once again, he calls the triple barrel as well and gets stacked by aces, of course. Some players can't fold their ace-king to a 5-bet pre-flop. Others can't let go of their set when the flush comes in on the river and villain bets big. So the second costly mistake you're making is you don't fold good-looking hands to a super strong range. The next league doesn't even seem like it is a league because you're not losing any money. But money not won is the same as money lost for your long-term win rate. A few months ago, I witnessed the following hand at a 1-2 game in London. Hero raised ace-king, villain called on the button. Flop came ace-10-3 rainbow. Hero checked. I don't hate this check because in theory you would check a lot in this spot, but in a live game against a recreational player I prefer a bet here. Villain checks behind. The turn brings in another ace. And yes, it's unlikely that we will make a lot of money with this hand, but at least there is a flush draw out there now. Whatever we do, we have to start putting some money in the middle. But wait, hero checks again, and villain checks behind again. The river is a blank, so now we really have to go for value. But no, hero checks once again. Finally, villain now bets almost pot. Hero check raises. But again, he makes it way too small. He needs to go to at least 90. Villain calls and shows down ace-queen. Hero hero should have stacked villain. Instead, he won a fairly small pot. And why is that? Because he was terrified of not making any money at all. So he preferred to make a bit of money. But that's not how poker works. You have to maximize your winnings when you have a great hand. Winning $300 3 times out of 10 is worth a lot more than winning $30 every single time. So the third league that keeps your poker stuck is you don't maximize your winnings when you have a great hand. This next league is one that is extremely common, both among bad players and good players. Even vloggers make this mistake. Look at this hand from a channel called Project Poker.
Ace-5 of diamonds to £10 after a limp from the cutoff and go heads up to a flop of Ace-2 King Rainbow. Villain checks and we c-bet third pot to £6 and get a call.
C-betting here is okay, although I would prefer to see a check because I don't think we can get 3 streets of value, probably not even 2 to be honest.
Hearts hits the turn and we double barrel, this time for 20 and get called given that
the vlogger says it himself. When he gets called, he expects villain to have an ace. So if we have 2 pair in this spot, or a strong ace like ace-queen or ace-jack, then I'm totally on board with this bet. But if the vast majority of hands that call us are ones that beat us, then why do we bet? The reasons for betting are: 1. to get called by a weaker hand. 2, to get a better hand to fold. 3, to protect against a hand that would have a lot of equity against us. If you can't find any of these 3 reasons to bet, then just check. And in this case, it is clear you don't really get called by a weaker hand. You certainly can't make a better hand fold, and there are no overcards that you would need to protect against. So just check. By the way, on the river, Hero says that he turned his top pair into a bluff to get Villain to fold an ace. Villain folded, although I doubt that he had an ace, because I don't think an ace would ever fold there to a bet that is not a huge overbet. But the leak was most obvious on the turn. So try to avoid this one by always double checking whether one of the 3 reasons for betting is fulfilled. The leak is you commit a polarization mistake. That means that you bet with the medium strength hand where you are likely to only get called by a better hand. But off to the next one, and this is the one that can totally ruin your win rate if you can't control it. So let me tell you about one of my students. He normally plays online and he's a really good student, always trying to learn new things and improve. At some point he decided to go to a live card room where he sat down and bought in for the maximum of 100 big blinds. In the very first hand he looked at ace-4 suited in early position, so he raised. There were a couple of callers and then an older man squeezed. The action folded to my student. Normally, this would be an easy fold, as we discussed in the section about league number 1. But my student got this feeling that a lot of us get at the poker table. He had just sat down, he wanted to play, he looked younger than everybody else, he was a foreigner and a newbie in that card room. He had this strong feeling that the players at the table wanted to set an example, that they wanted to show the new guy that he can't just come in and raise. So my student wouldn't have any of that and he shoved his ace-4 suited. The old man who had 3-bet him couldn't call quickly enough. He had aces, of course. My student realized that nobody wanted to set an example or teach the newbie a lesson. The recreational players in that room were playing their cards, nothing else. But I see this leak all the time, and sometimes I'm guilty of it as well. We take it personal when someone re-raises us rather than staying cool and waiting for a better spot. This is a mental game leak that can be extremely costly, and it is you let your ego make the decisions. Instead, you should focus on what your opponents do wrong and exploit them. One of the easiest way of doing this is to learn some typical behavior patterns your recreational opponents display. Congratulations, you've sat through this entire module. Now that you know what mistakes to avoid, let's move to a more fun topic. How to actually exploit your typical opponents and make more money.
Do you know how to maximize your winnings at live low-stakes poker? Well, it's certainly not by battling the best regs in your game or by applying perfect GTO concepts. The key to a bigger win rate is knowing how to exploit your opponents. And in this video, I'm going to show you 5 of my favorite exploits for live low-stakes poker. Every student of mine who has implemented these managed to increase their hourly rate at 1-2 and 1-3 live. If you master these, you will be a big winner in your games too. Especially the last one can be massive. It is the one exploit that pretty much doubled my win rate when I first started to do it consistently. Okay, so for the first one, I'd like to look at an example hand from a 1-2 game with effective stacks of $400. We raise our pocket jacks in the cutoff to 15 over 3 limpers, only the first limper calls. The flop is 10-8-4 rainbow. We make a continuation bet of $25 into the pot of 37. The limper calls. The turn is an innocuous looking offsuit deuce. We go for more value and bet $60. The limper waits for a few seconds and then raises to $150. We're getting more than 3-1, we have an overpair, so it looks like an easy call, right? Wrong! Let's just rewind the hand. The guy is a limper. He wants to see a cheap flop. He's not an aggressive maniac who pushes people around. He check-called a fairly big bet on the flop, so he probably has at least a pair or a very good draw. And now he puts in $150 as a check raise on the turn. Ask yourself, would he do that with a hand like Ace-10? I wouldn't completely rule it out, but it seems unlikely. First of all, he might have raised that hand pre-flop, and secondly, he could have check-raised the flop with that hand rather than waiting until the turn. Can he have a bluff? Again, I can't rule it out, but he could have bluffed on the flop. It seems odd that a passive limper risks $150 on the turn with a straight draw after he was super passive before. So the most likely type of hand would be a set that he slow played on the flop. This spot is one of the clearest folds at live low-stakes poker that you will ever see. Sure, a solver would probably fist pump call here, but in real life, this would be absolute spew. So my first favorite exploit is overfold to raises on later streets. Exploit number 2 is quite similar, even though there is a different pattern that you have to recognize. Let's compare two very quick scenarios. Here, villain is the preflop aggressor. We just called preflop in the big blind. There's $11 in the middle, and he now overbets $12 on the flop. I'm not saying that we should call or fold, it is just about what we think of this bet. And I think that this is probably a good hand that wants protection on a wet board. It can be the nuts, but it could just be a vulnerable top pair. And it could even be a bluff. And now let's look at the same villain in a different hand. Here we are on the river. There is $400 in the pot, and villain now bets $225. This is just over half pot, so you could think that it means that villain has a weaker hand than in the previous example. But this is totally different in what it means. A recreational player who bets $225 at any point in a hand means business. This is not a weak top pair that wants to find out where it stands. This is the nuts or close to the nuts. And here is the exploit. While in GTO terms, it's all about the percentage of the pot for recreational players, it is about the absolute value of the money. $225 even into a $600 pot would be a more significant bet than $12 into a pot of $11. So always keep this in mind when you face a big bet in monetary terms that actually doesn't look that much percentage-wise. But sometimes you need to be careful even with bets that are much smaller, like in this example. You raise to $5 with ace-jack offsuit in the hijack. The button calls. The flop is ace-7 deuce rainbow. You bet $7 into the pot of 13, he calls. The turn is an offsuit 10, you bet $20 into the pot of 27, he calls again. The river is a break. You now decide to take it slowly and check. Villain bets $50 into the pot of 67. I bet your initial reaction is to call. You have top pair with a good kicker after all. But think again. Villain called a bet on the flop and then another one on the turn. What do you think he would do this with? Well, there are no draws there, so he has to have at least a pair. It doesn't need to be a pair of aces, but he would not call twice without at least a pair of some sort. And when we check on the river, do you think he will bet $50 with a pair of sevens? Sure, it is not impossible. Some players do that, but it seems unlikely. He could have an ace, but would he really bet an ace with a weak kicker after you bet the flop and the turn? Again, not impossible, but in my experience, recreational players don't go for thin value bets. They are super happy to check behind with top pair. So what does he have then? I think this is at least two pair, if not a set. He had position throughout the hand, and the board was never too wet, so he didn't have to raise at any point. And now he wants to get thick value on the river. So this is a mandatory fold against typical recreational players at live poker. Here's what you could do instead. Just bet the river yourself, bet third pot, and he will call you with a weaker top pair, potentially even with the 7 if he doesn't believe you. But don't check call the river after you had the betting lead. Exploit number 4 is the easiest exploit ever, but so many players butcher this one. Here's an example. There are 5 limps and we just check our option with Queen Jack offsuit in the big blind. The flop comes Queen Jack deuce. We check and the player behind us bets $10. Everyone calls, including us. The turn brings in another queen. We now have the nuts. We check. The player behind us bets $30. Everyone calls again, including us. The river is a 6. We check and everyone else checks behind. We win a pot of $210 minus the rake. Sounds great, but look how much more we could have won. We were all $400 deep. I think we could have gotten at least another $200. So why did Hero miss out on that money? Because he was terrified that everyone would fold if he raised at any point. But let's rewind the hand. On the flop, everyone calls the $10, which means that they all have something. Just raise to $50 and at least 2 players will call you. And the same on the turn, you absolutely have to raise. If someone else has a queen, they will not fold. If someone has an open-ended straight draw, they will not fold. It's possible that someone with a jack might even call you. In live low-stakes poker, where you don't need to worry about being balanced, just fast play your hands. Sure, sometimes everyone will fold and you'll feel like an idiot. But your goal is to maximize winnings against players who have a hand rather than trying to make peanuts from players who have ace high or a weak pair. And now let's talk about the most important small stakes exploit. Here's a great example of this play. I raised ace-10 suited to 10 over a limper. Big blind and limper called. The flop comes 10-4 deuce, all hearts. I have top pair, so I will go for a continuation bet against passive players. Both call. The turn is an offsuit 9. At this point, I have to slow down, so I check behind. And then the river is an offsuit jack. Really not a great card from my hand. Now, a flush beats me, 2 pair beat me, a set beats me, and simply a jack beats me. But the thing is, how often do these players have a flush after they kept checking? Not very often. Sure, a set or 2 pair might play very passively on this board, but what about a jack? They could have the jack of hearts and maybe even jack 10. So if we bet this river, we don't expect to always get called by a weaker hand. We will sometimes get called and we will lose. And this is exactly why most players would happily check back in this spot. And I think that that is a mistake at live low stakes. Going for thin value is a bread and butter play. If you don't find these bets routinely on the river, you will leave tons of money on the table.
But Andreas, what if I get raised after I bet?
I hear you say. That is the other fear players often have, but it is actually really easy. Do you think that someone who limp called pre-flop and called the flop will now start bluffing you? No, if they missed whatever draw they had, they will usually fold. And if they have middle pair, they will either call or fold, but they won't turn it into a bluff. If you get check raised in this spot, it is an easy fold. So if you want to increase your win rate, use exploit number 5, which is bet for thin value on the river and fold to raises. Oh, and in this hand, I bet 25, big blind called me with a weaker hand. If you remember these 5 exploits, you will do very well in small stakes cash games.
Live poker in the trenches of 1-2 and 1-3 and even sometimes 2-5 is not about playing game theory optimal. Live poker is all about exploiting your recreational opponents and thus print money. So in this video I'm going to show you my top 6 exploits that you can use in live poker to crush the game and to increase your hourly rate. When I started playing live poker, I barely eked out a tiny win rate. This has been my win graph over the past years. since I started implementing these exploits more consistently. My name is Andreas Wagner. I'm a live low-stakes professional poker player based in London. Let's jump right into these exploits. And especially the last one will surprise you. It goes against everything poker coaches normally say, but I promise it will make your life so much easier. So get ready to start stacking those chips like Jenga blocks. Okay, let's start with one of the most important exploits. Here's an example hand. Can you spot the problem? A winning online reg goes to his local casino for the first time and sits down at a 1-2 game. He is card dead for about an hour, but he notices that there are big whales at his table and he seems to be the only good player. After an hour, he has pocket kings on the button. He raises to $5, the big blind, let's call him Moby Dick, calls. The flop comes Queen 7-4 rainbow. He c-bets $4 into the pot of $11, big blind calls. Turn is a harmless deuce. Our hero now polarizes and bets $25. Moby calls again. The river is a jack. The online reg knows that the big blind is a bad player, so he goes for value again. He bets $50 into the pot of $69. Big blind calls with Queen 10 offsuit. Our hero wins a pot of $169. So everything is great, right? Wrong. Yes, he got 3 streets of value, but this is hardly enough to retire and move to Florida. Here is how I would have played the hand. I would have raised to $10 pre-flop. On the flop, I would have bet another $10. On the turn, I would have made it $40, and on the river, $130. The pot would have been $380 instead of $169. That's more than double the size. And why is that? Because I would have raised to $10, which is 5 big blinds. Of course, this is not a GTO sizing. Of course, a good player can exploit me like crazy. But who cares? We established that there are no good players at the table. These whales will not know how to exploit me. In fact, the main exploit of such a big raise size is to call super tight. Do you think that your opponents at 1-2 or 1-3 will call you with a super tight range if you raise to 5 big blinds? I highly doubt it. So this is our first big exploit. Raise bigger pre-flop. If you can get away with it, you can even raise your big hands to 5 or 6 big blinds and raise smaller with marginal hands. The bigger raise sizes are one of the main reasons why live poker is so much more profitable than online poker. Okay, let's move to exploit number 2, and this is kind of the other side of the coin. This is about the other player's bet sizing. Look at this example. This friendly recreational player open raised 5 times in the last 20 minutes. Every time he raised to 7. Once he had pocket 4s, once he had king 10 offsuit, and once he had ace 6 offsuit. He didn't show down the other 2 times. Now we have king 10 suited in the big blind, and he makes it 12. Apart from the fact that a call with king 10 suited becomes borderline at best in GTO when the opponent raises to 6 big blinds, this is a big red flag. I folded in this example and the gentleman turned over pocket aces and got really annoyed that no one gave him action. Well, he has a sizing tell that's bigger than Pinocchio's nose. Had he raised to 7 like he did with all the other hands, I would certainly have called and he could have made some money. Instead, he won the absolute minimum and felt frustrated. So exploit number 2 is adjust to their bet sizes. But be careful with this exploit. You have to observe players carefully and pay attention to the hands they show down, because there are some players who do the opposite. They will raise big with weak hands and go tiny with big hands. The best exploit then is to 3-bet light when they bet big and play speculative hands when they raise small. Off to exploit number 3, which has been one of my favorites for many years. Here's an example. Can you spot it? There is a limp. We raise ace 10 offsuit on the button. The limper calls our $10 bet. The flop is queen 8 deuce, and the limper now bets $7, which is third pot. This bet is called a donk bet, which means that someone bets on a street where he was not the aggressor on the previous street. It doesn't necessarily mean that the player who makes it is a donk, but in live poker, the clue is often in the name. So what does he do this with? Well, he could have all sorts of hands. He could have connected with a board. He could have a pocket pair like 7s or 9s. Last week, an older gentleman had ace-king in exactly this spot. And sometimes you will see players do this with a set or 2 pair, but that is very rare. Most of the time, they have some sort of a marginal hand. So what should our play be? Well, that depends on what we have. If we have a marginal hand ourselves, then I would just call. For example, if I had pocket jacks or queen 10 in this example. If I have a big hand, I might also just call, but the main exploit here is raise the donk bet. If I have a bluff, like in our example, I will definitely raise. Usually, this will get the job done. It is often like taking candy from a baby if the baby had a gambling problem. My villain the other day folded ace-king face up and said that now he knew where he stood. Sometimes they will call with their marginal hands. What do we do on the turn in that case? We bet again, ideally a healthy bet of 3/4 or so. Okay, and what if he calls our turn bet as well? I would usually give up. By the way, if you ever play in a game where nobody knows you, but you know that someone is a pro, you can just trick them with this. You call pre-flop, and when you have a strong hand, you just donk small. As I said, pretty much every pro will raise there if they don't know that you are a good player. This is one of the few ways how you can exploit a pro. But now on to the next exploit. I played this hand just a few days ago. A recreational player opens to 7. I make it 21 with queen jack of hearts in position. He calls. The flop comes jack 8 4 with 2 spades. I bet 30. He calls. The pot is now 105. On the turn, we improve to top 2 pair on this wet board. We still continue value betting, so I make it 90. The recreational player thinks for a while and then jams his entire stack of 350 pounds. If you're a seasoned online player, this is probably a snap call for you. If you're a seasoned live player, this is probably close to a snap fold. But we have top 2 pair in a 3-bet pot. How can we fold, you might say? Well, a recreational player has just check-raised you all in for a significant amount of money. I am not saying that this is never a bluff, but the vast majority of recreational players will not bluff in this spot. This is almost always a straight, a set, or 2 pair. So yes, maybe you're chopping with the same hand, but against this range we are absolutely toast. So exploit number 4 is value bet good hands until you face aggression. And once you do face aggression, overfold to that aggression. You will get bluffed at times, but long term, this is the strategy to riches at live low stakes poker. Exploit number 5 is kind of a cousin to number 4, and I'll explain it with another example. We raise pocket deuces and get called by a player on the button. The flop comes queen 8 deuce with 2 spades. We have bottom set. Yes! So we bet big. He calls. The turn is an offsuit 4, which is basically a brick. We now bet pot and he calls again. The river is the jack of spades. We are annoyed and check. He bets close to pot. We are disgusted, but flick in the call because, hey, we have a big hand, right? If you want to know how to burn money fast, then always make this call. I used to make this mistake all the time in my early career. But this is worse than raising 7 deuce offsuit in early position pre-flop. But Andreas, we have a set. How can it be so bad to call it off? Well, let's rewind the hand. We bet fairly big on the flop, so we should eliminate a lot of junk from his range already. Then, on the turn, we bet pot. At this point, only some good hands like a queen or better and draws call. On the river, the flush gets there. And yes, he could still have a hand like king-queen or queen-jack. But how many opponents would bet that hand after you showed so much strength and now the flush has come in? Almost nobody does that. It would mean turning their top pair into a bluff, which almost never happens in low-stakes poker. Could they have any bluffs in their range? Absolutely not. I can't see a single hand that would call the flop, call the turn, and then be a bluff on the river. So exploit number 5 is don't check call on the river unless draws brick. Players underbluff the river in live poker because they get to this point with a range that is either very strong or it is made of bluff catchers. But they wouldn't bet those bluff catchers if checked to. So here's my advice. If you get to the river with a decent hand, you either value bet it yourself if you think that you can get called by worse, or you check fold, but don't check call. And now to exploit number 6, which is the one that will probably surprise you. And I have another example for you. This is a hand I witnessed last week, and I'm still shaking my head around it. An unknown player was involved in a pot with a player who was clearly a bad player who would call down with top pair. So the unknown hero bet the flop and the turn, and then the river with king high. Predictably, he got called down by second pair. As the dealer pushed the chips over to the fish, our unknown hero gave a speech about how he had to balance his range, which is why he tripled it off there. Rarely have I heard such nonsense at the poker table, although I do hear a lot of nonsense there. He was up against a guy who only sees his hand as being second pair. He probably didn't even consider that the unknown hero might have a bigger hand. He just called down because he had second pair. Hero lost most of his stack because he thought he had to be balanced against the fish rather than focusing on the opponent's leaks, which were crystal clear. So exploit number 6 is just play your hand, not your range.
Would you like to have one weapon in your poker arsenal that helps you double your win rate? It's actually easier than you think. Now, I'm not saying that your hourly rate will explode overnight, but look at this. I have played poker for almost a decade, but in the first few years my win rate would look like this. I was a winning player, but I went through big swings and my hourly rate was just about positive. I have improved many aspects of my game, but it was this one play that helped me break through. So in this video, I will share with you what this play is, how even less advanced players can implement this in their game, and why it is much less risky than most players think. My name is Andreas Wagner, I'm a live low-stakes coach, and I believe that what you're about to hear today will truly increase your win rate at the live low-stakes poker tables. In order to understand what this play is, we have to look at the biggest mistakes live low-stakes players make. They call too much, they don't bluff often enough, and they play their big hands too fast because they're terrified of getting outdrawn. And the play I'm talking about takes advantage of all these things. It punishes the fact that they call too much and takes advantage of them not bluffing enough, while we wouldn't even get to do it if they had a really strong hand because they would already have raised on an earlier street and we would have folded. So here's an example of this play in action. We play in a 1-3 with an under the gun straddle to 6 and we have pocket 10s in the cutoff. We raise to 15 and only the straddle, a loose passive recreational player, calls. On the board of Queen 9-6 with 2 clubs, we could either check or bet. In this example, we bet a bit more than half pot and we get called. The turn is an offsuit 3. When villain checks, I think we have a clear check behind. It is getting increasingly more difficult to get called by a worse hand again, and almost impossible to get 3 streets of value with our hand. So we check. The river is another complete brick, and our passive opponent checks once again. What would you do in this example? Well, most players would happily check behind. But let's think for a moment. How often do we think that we have the best hand in this spot? I would say almost always. If villain had a big hand, he might have check-raised the flop because the board was scary. Sure, he can have a queen when he calls, but once the draws break out, it seems likely that he would bet a queen on the river because he would worry that we check behind. And most players' actions are driven by greed when they have a good hand. And if he has a 9 or a hand like pocket 7s or 8s, he would call a bet on the river, especially because the flush missed, and so he might talk himself into thinking that we missed the flush. So we should definitely bet here. And this is the mysterious play I'm talking about. It is called thin value betting on the river.
But Andreas, what if we get check raised?
I hear you say. Well, we can worry about that if it happens. Don't stress about it now because most likely it will never happen. We just established that it's unlikely that villain has a strong hand. And he is a passive recreational player. And passive recreational players rarely start check raising rivers as a bluff for what they perceive as a lot of money. So we bet just under half pot and villain quickly calls with a 9. It is precisely this last bet that makes or breaks your win rate at live low stakes. And this also works in 3-bet pots, like in this example. A loose player opens to 12 at a 1-2. A tight player and a very loose player both call. We squeeze with ace-king in position. We could have gone a bit bigger, but whatever. The original raiser and the very loose player call. This is a really nice spot. We have position, we have the initiative, and we have a premium hand. What's even better is that the flop is king 10-9 rainbow, giving us top pair, top kicker. We c-bet for a third pot and only the original raiser calls. Oh, and speaking of c-betting, I have just released my new ebook, Cbet Mastery. You can get a free copy just by clicking on the link below. But back to the hand. After we c-bet the flop and we got called by the original raiser, the 8 of clubs on the turn brings a flush draw. We could continue betting for value, but I didn't think I could get 3 streets of value, so I checked behind with a plan to bet on a safe river. But the river doesn't look safe at all. It brings in the flush and the 4-liner to a straight. So should we just check behind with our top pair? Not against a loose passive recreational player. If she had had a set, a straight, or 2 pair on the flop, she would probably have raised on such a wet board in a multi-way pot. Of course she could have hit a set on the turn or a river and got scared to bet it, but that's not a reason to check behind because it is still very unlikely. If she has a king or pocket jacks or even a hand like ace 10, there is a good chance that she will call a river bet. So we go for just over half pot, she tanks for a bit and calls with king queen and we scoop a nice pot. The reason why most players won't bet thinly for value on the river is fear. But this fear is like being afraid of losing an arm wrestling contest with a baby. A baby does not have the muscle power to defeat an adult man. And a passive recreational player usually doesn't have the bluff check raise weapon in their arsenal. Almost definitely not when they would have to risk their entire stack. If you ever get check raised after making a thin value bet, you will not make a mistake if you always fold. Of course, you would be super exploitable, but again, a passive recreational player will not exploit you. If they raise, believe them. This spot is extremely underbluff at the low stakes. Sometimes you will fold the best hand because you will accidentally get bluffed though. I remember a hand where I made a thin value bet on the river with pocket aces on a scary board where a flush was possible. My opponent min raised me and I folded because I just couldn't see him bluff in that spot. And he didn't bluff at all, he proudly showed top pair, top kicker in that hand. When someone asked him why he raised with top pair when I could have had a flush, he admitted that he hadn't seen that there was a flush possible. He thought he had a hand close to the nut. This will happen sometimes, but it is very rare and is more than offset by the times when you get paid off. And yes, there is of course a chance that this play will go wrong, that you will value own yourself, like in this example. We open ace-jack offsuit on the button over a limper, the small blind and the limper both call. We have top pair and make a fairly big c-bet and the small blind calls. On the turn we continue betting for value and we get called. The river is pretty much a brick. Can we get another street of value from a passive opponent? I think we can. He might fold a jack or a 5, but because the flush missed, he might talk himself into a call. But note that if we get called, we will not always win. And this is exactly what happened. I bet and he called with a river 2 pair. We lost a fairly big pot because we got unlucky on the river, but it was still the right play. If you never get called by a better hand when you bet for value, then you are not betting thinly enough and you leave money on the table.
Is your win rate in live poker not where you would like it to be? Well, I used to have this issue until I discovered a strategy that doubled my win rate at 1-2 and 1-3 live. I made a video about it a while back, but today I'm going to show you my exact foolproof method how to actually implement the system so that you can just copy me. My name's Andreas Wagner, I'm a live poker coach who has gone from being a break-even player to teaching dozens of clients how to crush the live low stakes. So, how can you double your win rate? Well, one shortcut is knowing when and how to Cbet correctly. And I actually wrote a short free ebook called Cbet Mastery that covers exactly that. You can grab it with a link below completely for free. But the strategy I want to walk you through today goes even further. It's not just about Cbets, it's about using a simple structured process to know exactly when to go for thin value and when to check back. Recently, one of my viewers left this comment under one of my videos. I have a conflict in my head. I like thin betting, I like avoiding polarization mistakes, but here those two ideas seem to be in conflict. And then my assistant Molly, who is a talented player herself, added,
I often struggle to find thin value bets on rivers. I'm quite guilty of checking back second pair when I could be betting it.
And then I realized that the problem is not actually the thin value betting itself, it lies much deeper, and that's what we are going to talk about today. It is simply the answer to the one question: how do we know when to value bet thinly and when to check back? The answer to this question is rooted in hand reading your opponent. If we know roughly what his most likely holding is on the river, then it becomes a really easy decision what to do. And the good news is that at the live low stakes, your opponent will usually let you know roughly what they have. So I've developed a framework for you to think about on every street so you won't be guessing what to do on the river. We can explain this with a funnel. A funnel has a big opening at the top, and then the funnel gets smaller and smaller until at the end there is only a small opening. That's how hand reading works too. Before our opponent even acts, he has every single hand combination in his range. He could have pocket aces, but he could also have 7 deuce offsuit or 9-4 offsuit. Once he raises or calls, we now know that some of the possible hands are not in his range anymore, so the funnel gets smaller. Same on the flop, turn, and river. The more money a player puts into the pot, the smaller this opening of the funnel typically gets. Now I hear you ask,
But Andreas, how can we put our opponent on a range in real time while sitting at the table and having lots of things to think about?
To answer this question, I have created a 6-step path for you. So let's go through the 6 steps. The very first step is to pay attention and not distract yourself with talking to other players or texting your boss. This sounds so basic, but honestly, a lack of paying attention is the #1 reason why so many players are so terrible when it comes to hand reading. Because hand reading happens even when you're not in a hand. This is when you notice if a player has a limping range and what hands go into that limping range. This is where you see if they're capable of thin value betting themselves or if they call down too light. The information you gain in step 1 will be super valuable for the next steps. Steps 2 through 6 all happen in the actual hand that you play against a specific villain. So step 2 is pre-flop. This is also a fairly easy one. All you have to do is to quickly assign your opponent or opponents, if the pot goes multi-way, a very rough range. If you did step 1 right, you will know at this point if this particular opponent splits his opening range into a limping range and a raising range. And you should know roughly if he is loose or tight when he calls a bet pre-flop. Also very important, what hands are now extremely unlikely given the pre-flop action. For example, if you raise and there are 3 callers and now the big blind overcalls, he will most likely not have aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace-king. At this point, you definitely don't have to be exact with your hand reading, just a rough idea of different hand buckets is enough. For example, small and medium pairs, suited connectors, big cards, ace-x hands, etc. This should be the easiest street because you can do this in every hand and the ranges are quite static. Then let's move to step 3. This one's on the flop. Here we continue with the buckets. Whatever action an opponent takes, think what hands they would do this with. And this is the key. What hands can you eliminate at this point? Because say you raised pre-flop, they called in the small blind and the big blind also called. Now the flop comes 9-8-6 with 2 hearts. If you c-bet small and he calls, we can probably eliminate a straight, a set or even 2 pair, because on such a wet board and with another player in the pot, the small blind would most likely raise such a monster. But here on the flop, you still have to leave their range quite wide, because you often only bet small, so they might even call with ace high or a gut shot. But step 4 is where a lot of the magic happens, on the turn. Ironically, this is the most misplayed street in Texas Hold'em. And if you can get this one right, you will have a good chance of crushing this game. But this is where most players lose their head because they don't hand read properly. But it's actually quite simple. Whatever happened on the flop, in combination with a turn card, determine your action. As we said, if you bet the flop really small, it means that your villain will have a wide range on the turn. If you bet big on the flop, now his range is stronger because you would probably have folded a lot of the light floats like ace high or bottom pair. How big you bet determines if the funnel will be steeper or flatter. The turn is where you polarize, and this is exactly where most players mess up, like in this example. You raise Jack-10 pre-flop and get 2 callers. The flop comes ace-Jack 4, you c-bet, the big blind calls. The turn is an inconsequential deuce, you now bet again. Can you spot the mistake? It was the turn bet. On the flop, I don't love the c-bet either with middle pair against 2 opponents, but it's not a disaster. We can't say the same about the turn though. The big blind called the flop, and yes, maybe he called with pocket 7s or Jack 9, but if you bet on the turn, what do you accomplish? Will he fold an ace? Probably not. So, you're not bluffing, right? Are you betting for value? Well, do you think he will call again with 7s or Jack 9? It's not impossible, but seems a bit unlikely. So betting big here is a so-called polarization mistake, because on the turn is where you polarize. You almost never bet small. You usually bet big or check. And a polarization mistake happens when you bet a hand big that doesn't want to put a lot of money in the middle. But whatever you do on the turn, this is what will mainly inform your decision whether to value bet thinly on the river or not. And here is step 5, the river play. Rivers are even easier because often a lot of filtering has been done. If you bet the flop and the turn and he called, you know that he is left with a fairly strong range. Possibly he has a missed draw, but other than that, he will arrive on the river with a good hand. Again, think in buckets. Can he still have sets or 2 pairs, or is he capped at 1 pair and draws? If you bet the flop small and you check the turn behind, he has a very wide range because you didn't filter by betting. If you bet the turn big on the other hand, he now has a much stronger range. So if you have top pair, top kicker, and you bet the flop small and the turn big, you might even be able to get a third street of value. Yes, it is thin, but he can call you with a weaker top pair. And if you bet the flop small, then check back the turn, you can almost certainly go for thin value on the river with what is now second pair. But if you have a weak top pair and you bet both the flop and the turn big, now a river bet would be too thin because he called 2 bets. It doesn't mean that you don't have the best hand, but if you bet the river, he might fold all the hands that you beat and only call you with the hands that beat you. At this point, I hear you ask,
But Andreas, in my games, there are a lot of players who I can't range like that. They show up with all sorts of hands and all sorts of spots, and I never know if I'm ahead or behind.
I totally hear you here. Those players are tricky to play against, but that's why we have one more step left, step 6. But before we go to the actual step 6, you have to understand something about these players. If they are extremely loose and they really show up with all sorts of hands, then long term you will crush them. That sounds like a tough environment, but it's actually an opportunity. When players are unpredictable and playing lots of hands, they're making mistakes, and that's where your edge comes from. It might seem like they always have 2 pair, but this is not the case. Over time, you'll profit from their inconsistency, even if in the moment you feel like an idiot. But anyway, here is step 6, and if you forget everything I told you so far, make sure to remember this one, because if all you do is get step 6 right, you will still do much better than before. So, what are these 6 steps for? We want to find out when we can go for thin value or not. So here is one question you should always ask yourself when considering betting thinly for value on the river. Is this opponent capable of check raising me as a bluff on the river? If the answer to this question is no, then your win rate will forgive you for betting too thinly. Because it is absolutely okay to value own yourself, meaning that villains call you with a better hand. But if an opponent is capable of check raise bluffing you on the river, then you have to be much more careful. So if your opponent who can show up with any 2 cards on the river is not the type who would check raise as a bluff, then you basically always go for thin value. What if I told you there was an easy poker trick, one that's super simple to use but that transforms your win rate? You'll still need solid fundamentals, you won't get around those, but this trick takes them to the next level. This is something the great poker players we all admire know and use all the time, and this is also how I managed to consistently beat the 1-2 and 1-3 live games in London. Now it's time for you to learn it too. So today we're going to do just that. I'll break it down step by step and show you this simple trick that good poker players use to win more. Let's get started. When a new player starts studying poker, there is one thing that he gets told early on by experienced players. Poker is about ranges, not about individual hands. This is, of course, very sound advice, but it can overcomplicate things, especially for beginners, because there are so many things to think about when you're in a poker hand. You're trying to remember your range, your opponent's range, pot odds, stack sizes. Meanwhile, the waitress asks if you want mozzarella sticks and your brain just short circuits. That's why the trick I'm about to show you is so useful. And here it is in action. Let's say you're in a 1-2 game sitting in the big blind with pocket sevens. A very tight middle position player raises to $10, the cutoff calls and you call behind. 3 players see a flop of Jack 7-3 rainbow. You have middle set. You check, the pre-flop raiser bets $30, the cutoff folds. Action is on you. Now, standard poker thinking goes like this. What does my range look like here? I have some sets, some strong top pairs, some weak pairs, some gut shots, and total air. A solver might suggest mixing calls and check raises with middle set in this spot. What solvers don't do is consider their opponent's range or their tendencies. Solvers simply don't care. They're quite selfish, really. They play an unexploitable strategy, so they are only concerned about what they do and not what the opponent could have. Newer players who start taking poker studies seriously know that they have to think about their opponent's range though, because humans can't compute like solvers. And it wouldn't be advisable anyway, because it's a lot more profitable to exploit players than to play a game theory optimal style. But this adds a layer of complication, of course. Not only are they now thinking about their own range, but also about their opponent's range, and possibly also about what their opponents think that they have. I'm sure you've heard the saying, what does he think that he thinks that I have? Mozzarella sticks, maybe? The thing about poker is that it's usually the simple, boring things that make the money long term, not fancy thinking or moves. And that's exactly why this easy trick is so powerful. Because at live low stakes, you can cut out all the noise and just concentrate on two things. And here it is, the easy trick. Only think about your own hand and your opponent's range. That's it. You always want to play your hand against their range. That means you don't need to play fancy. In fact, most break-even or slightly losing players would be small winners at these stakes if they simply cut out any fanciness from their game. You just need to understand your opponent's tendencies. Are they the type to continuation bet almost always? Do they only bet when they hit top pair or better? Start paying attention to how they play certain types of hands. Poker is a game of unknowns, so you still have to put your opponent on a range of hands or at least buckets of hands like sets, flush draws, gut shots, total air, etc. But you know what your hand is, so don't add layers of complexity by trying to balance your play. Most of your recreational opponents at 1-2 or 1-3 or even 2-5, frankly, won't be able to exploit you. Nobody in these games is running you through a solver in real time. They're playing their cards, making their best guesses and reacting emotionally when they face aggression. They're probably more likely to exploit the buffet than your bet sizing. So let's go back to our example to see how this works. We said that the original raiser was a tight player. He raised pre-flop and he c-bet on the flop. It is of course possible that he has a hand like ace-king, ace-queen or king-queen, but against this hand class we won't make a lot of money anyway because we don't expect him to continue bluffing. A hand class that he might have are big pocket pairs like aces, kings, queens, and we can add ace-jack to this hand class as well because it is top pair, top kicker. There are a total of 30 combos of these hands, so quite a few of them. He could also have pocket nines or tens, although he might not have c-bet these hands, so I would discount them a little bit. And he could of course have pocket jacks for top set. If he has jacks, we will go broke in this hand no matter what course of action we take. If he has ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, then we don't make a lot of money no matter what course of action we take either. So the only bucket we really care about is the one with the overpair and top pairs. And we don't have to be balanced ourselves at all. It doesn't matter if we would never check raise as a bluff in this spot. We simply think what our hands wants to do against our opponent's range. Or, as high stakes poker pro Charlie Carroll said, what is their range and what does our hand want to do about it? So, in this example, we'll just check raise, and if he calls, we'll shove the turn and hopefully scoop a nice big pot. This is how I have been playing live poker successfully for years. Why does this trick work so well in live poker? There are a couple of reasons. One, as we said, most players aren't thinking about your range. They're not looking at what you should have. They're just reacting to what you do, and they're only playing their cards. And two, exploitative play is more profitable than balanced play in soft games. Truly balanced play is unbeatable, yes, but if everyone at the table were to play a balanced strategy, then nobody would win except for the card room that makes a lot of money in rake. But noticing what your opponents do wrong and exploiting their mistakes is what makes your win rate at live low-stakes poker look like this. You're not up against robots, you're up against people who play too loose, call too much, and don't adjust properly. This approach streamlines your thought process and keeps you focused even when the table gets chaotic. Now, does this mean you should always ignore your range? No. In tougher games against players who do adjust, you have to be more careful. Even at 1-2, there might be one player at the table on average who will see through what you're doing. If you're involved in a pot against this player, you might want to be a bit more selective with your actions, but quite frankly, if you just treat every player at 1-2 as someone who won't be able to exploit you, you will be just fine in the long run. That's why in the live low stakes games that most of us play, this trick is a shortcut to making better, more profitable decisions. So next time you're in a hand, ask yourself, what does my actual hand want to do against my opponent's range? Just find the answer to this question and you'll make money with it long term. And while this is a very useful adjustment to make, there are a few more shortcuts that you can take to beat live low stakes poker. Being good is obviously the baseline for winning money at poker, but what if I told you that there are 3 other factors that have a massive impact on your win rate, even though hardly anyone ever talks about them? In this video, I'm going to show you what these 3 factors are and how you can use them to potentially skyrocket your winnings too. The difference between always doing these 3 things and never doing them can literally mean the difference between a $10 per hour win rate and a $20 per hour win rate at 1-2, and at 2-5 and 5-10 this can be the difference between earning $20 an hour to $60 an hour. My name is Andreas Wagner. I'm a live low stakes professional poker player based in London, and I had to learn these things the hard way. You can take a shortcut by watching this video, and pay very close attention to the last factor, because that one can really make or break your profitability. Do you remember the last time you walked into a casino and started playing poker only to notice that everyone at your table was either a good reg or a nit? Nobody said a word, half of the players were wearing headphones, and raise sizes came straight out of a GTO playbook. At the table behind you, there was a lot of laughter and banter, however. Everyone there seemed to have a great time, and you heard the dealer announce all in and a call all the time. Which of these 2 tables is the better one? Only from these few snippets of information you should know that the second table is miles better. This seems kind of obvious, but most players don't know how big the difference actually is. I'm going to illustrate this by showing you what the win rates for everybody at the table are. Let's say there are 8 players on each of the tables, and let's assume we're playing 1-2. At the first table, there are 5 regs whose hourly rate is normally around $15 for each of them. 2 nits roughly break even. And there is 1 losing player who donates around $20 per hour. What do you think is your expected win rate in this game? I hate to break it to you, but we can't talk about win rates. The question should be, what do you think is your loss rate in this game? The reason is that on average, the table will have to pay around $80 per hour in rake. But we only have 1 player who loses $20 per hour, so everybody else has to make up for the shortfall. So if you're sitting in this game, you're likely to lose around $5 per hour, even if you're one of the best players at the table. And now let's look at the second table. Let's say there are 2 top pros, 1 good reg, 3 slightly losing players, and 2 big whales. The pros average $20 an hour each. The good reg makes $15. The 3 losing players lose $5 each per hour, and the whales bleed $100 per hour each. The rake at this table will be higher because of the loser action, so let's say it's about $100. So one of the whales basically just pays for the rake. But now there is another $100 from the second whale and the combined $15 from the slightly losing players up for grabs. A total of $115 that can be divvied up between the 2 pros and the good reg. These are obviously not perfect calculations, but they show what a massive difference the right or the wrong table makes. So the first crucial factor for a healthy win rate is table selection. Always try to be at the best possible table. Don't play in bad games and don't be lazy about it. But on to tip number 2, which really separates the good players from the not so good ones. Let me ask you a question. Is it a good idea to open 10-8 suited from early position? If you have watched a few of my videos, you will probably expect me to say that this is a big mistake. And well, you wouldn't be totally wrong. However, there are scenarios when I will do this, and you should too. For example, let's say you're sitting at a very passive table with the 5 players to your left all play very tight, and the two blinds are both really bad players. In this scenario, I would not mind opening 10-8 suited. It is by no means a mistake to just fold, but if I have a good chance to play this hand in position against two whales, then I will open it. Same applies to 3-betting Jack-5 offsuit on the button against a cutoff raise. I would normally say this is a crazy 3-bet. But if the cutoff is a super straightforward player who folds everything to a 3-bet that's not aces or kings, then I will do it. I actually once did this to such a player. He snap folded pocket jacks face up and said, "There is no way that you don't have kings in that spot." Well, I didn't. So what's my point here? Good players sometimes do things that seem unconventional, but they don't just do them because they feel like it. They have a reason. If you have a well-reasoned argument why deviating from your regular strategy might be more profitable, then it is okay to do it. But for this, you have to be confident in both your reads and your skills. This is not a blank check to start justifying every bad raise or call. Otherwise, the other players will soon have a reason to want to play more pots against you. So this tip was important, but remember, I said that the last one is the most important one. If you don't follow this one, I will guarantee you that your win rate will go into the deepest basement. I have seen so many players fall victim to this one. Here is an example from just a couple of days ago. I sat down at a table. In my first hand, I looked down at pocket kings. Exciting. I 4-bet jammed against a big 3-bet. Well, the guy had aces. I lost. Then I raised ace-king, got called by 3 players. I missed the flop and had to fold. 10 minutes later, I check-raised the turn as a bluff and got re-raised and had to fold. And to add insult to injury, I flopped a set of 6s, but the board ran out with a 4 straight and I got bluffed on the river. It was one of those days when absolutely everything went against me. I lost around £1,000 at 1-2 in just 4 hours of play. I'm not telling you this because I want pity. No, I'm telling you this because I'm actually proud how I handled the situation. Don't get me wrong, that session absolutely sucked. But I didn't blow up. I managed to keep my cool, and once I noticed that my decision making was not super sharp anymore, I decided to just quit. I had planned to play for 8 hours, but I left after 4. So many players lose their cool on such a day. They turn their session from a bad one into a horrible one. Especially in live poker, I have seen this happen so many times. Live poker moves at an insanely slow pace. If you lose a big pot, it can take an hour or even longer until you have the chance to play another big pot where you actually have an edge. It requires patience and mental resilience to not just give away your money in such a situation. Many players want to force it, so they make bad bluffs, bad call downs, just bad decisions altogether. Recently, a guy lost a medium-sized pot with aces when his villain's gut shot came in on the river. In the next hand, he punted off his entire stack of almost 400 big blinds. Except that sometimes you will be at the receiving end of a bad beat. And yes, you will make mistakes, and you will make big mistakes. Everybody does, even the best players in the world. And also accept that there will be sessions when you will be card dead. But remember, even if you are card dead, you're actually making money on paper as long as you follow tip number 1 and you sit at a good table. Just by sitting there, you are raking in a decent hourly rate in theory, even if you finish the session with a big fat minus. So don't be the guy who gets angry and loses his cool. Sit with the pain. Don't force it. And wait for a spot where you will actually have an edge.
Do you ever consider being balanced and playing GTO at live low-stakes poker? Most of the time you shouldn't, because exploiting your opponents is where the money is made. But there are 4 spots where the theoretical play is the one that is the best for your win rate. In this video, I will show you what those 4 plays are, when you should implement them, and how they can help you win more money at 1-2, 1-3, and 2-5. My name is Andreas Wagner, I'm a live poker coach based in London, and I use these plays all the time. I would like to start with a scary one, but don't worry, if you don't feel ready for this one, there will be easier ones later in the video. To illustrate the first one, let's have a look at a hand that I played. One of the better players at the table opens to 8 pounds in the low jack. A weak player calls in the small blind. We have Jack 10 of hearts in the big blind. It is fine to just call here, but I don't like playing multi-way pots as the monkey in the middle, so I prefer a 3-bet squeeze. Unfortunately, the good player calls and the weak player folds. I would have preferred it the other way around. Anyway, the flop comes King 9-4 Rainbow. This is a board where we can bet our entire range because we have such a big range advantage. We have all the good hands and our villain needs to fold hands like pocket pairs and some ace high straight away. But he calls. The turn is the deuce of spades, bringing in a flush draw. We still have a gut shot, so we have some outs, and so we go for another bet. Villain calls again. The river is another 4. At this point we could give up because villain called twice. But if we triple barrel jam this spot, we will get a huge amount of folds. Even in GTO terms, villain is supposed to fold queens and jacks as well as missed ace-high flush draws, but he's meant to call 10-9 suited. And I really doubt that he will call 10-9 suited. I could even see him fold king-queen suited because in live low-stakes poker, triple barrels are severely underbluffed. If you triple barrel this spot, it looks like you have at least aces. So the first GTO play that increases your win rate at live low-stakes poker is the triple barrel in a 3-bet pot. But you don't always want to empty the clip. Sometimes GTO takes a much more passive route, and the second play is such an example. In this one, we call a cutoff raise with Jack 9 of spades in the big blind. The flop comes 8-5 deuce Rainbow, but with 1 spade. Villain Cbet small. Here we have 2 options. Calling is fine, but this is an excellent candidate for a light check raise. We have a backdoor flush draw, a backdoor straight draw, and 2 overcards to top pair. This is exactly what we want for a light check raise. Unfortunately, villain calls though. The turn is an offsuit ace. Should we continue bluffing? Well, solvers slowed down significantly here. Had the turn improved our equity either by giving us a flush draw or a straight draw, then we could have continued barreling. But on this turn, we have to give up. There is basically no way we can improve if we get called, so we would rely completely on fold equity. Plus, this ace might help villain if he called with a hand like ace-king. If the turn had been an offsuit queen, then we could have barreled because we would A, have picked up a gut shot, and B, the queen is unlikely to have helped. So he then might fold a hand like ace-king as well as an 8 or a pocket pair below the queen. But the GTO play that increases your win rate at live low-stakes poker is to give up with hands that don't improve after we made a light check raise on the flop. But now we're going back to a more aggressive move. This time we open pocket 6s under the gun. A rather aggressive villain calls in the big blind. The flop comes ace-queen deuce with 2 diamonds. We could Cbet this because we might get some better pocket pairs to fold, but this is an aggressive opponent, so I'd rather bluff catch on the turn than risk getting raised on the flop. So we check back. The turn brings in an offsuit 6. We now have a set. Villain bets around pot. A lot of players would just call in this spot, and it's not terrible against an aggressive opponent, but we can get value from a flush draw, an ace, maybe 2 pair, or even a set of deuces. So we raise, he calls. The river is a brick. When he checks to us, we will definitely bet, but the question is how much? A lot of players would go half pot or 3/4 pot, but think about it. If he has a missed flush draw, he will fold even if you bet $5. And if he has an ace or even 2 pair, he might look you up because he thinks you might have a missed flush draw. So this is the spot to go big. And GTO would definitely overbet here. It might even go all in. Now, I think an all in might generate too many folds, but you can definitely go at least 1.5x pot. So the third GTO play that works at live low stakes is to overbet the river with value when the flush draw misses. I kept the most accessible play until the end because I think that this is the most important one. If you are not advanced enough yet to think about the first 3 plays, then pay close attention now because you should not miss this one. And it even shows you how to bluff successfully at live low stakes. But before we continue, please smash that like button, it would help me a lot, thank you. Okay, back to our play. Here's an example. We call Queen 10 suited in the big blind against the cutoff open. The flop is Jack 8 deuce rainbow. Villain Cbet's half pot. While this is a good spot to check raise, we only have one overcard to the top card on the board, and this time Villain Cbet a bit bigger, so we just call with our gut shot. The turn is a 5, and both players check. The river is a 4. What's your play here? Whatever you do, do not check. A check here would be a massive blunder. Imagine you check and villain turns over a7, king queen, or pocket 6s. Those are hands that probably fold if you just breathe at the pot. We can assume that he just fired a c-bet on the flop pretty much as a range bet. So there are plenty of hands that he will fold to a bet that would win at showdown. And even king 8, ace 5, or other one-pair hands will fold if you bet on the bigger side. Solvers would mix between all sorts of sizes from third pot to 1.5 times the pot. It doesn't really matter what size you choose as long as you bet. My favorite size would be around pot or slightly over. This is a mandatory river probe bet. These 4 plays should get you a long way, but as you know, exploiting your opponents is where the real money is made.
Imagine sitting at the live poker table and just watching your stack grow without you ever having to do anything fancy. Well, this is exactly what we are going to talk about today. After having played live poker successfully for about a decade, I have come across all sorts of recreational players, and I have learned some methods to crush players at 1-2 and 1-3 live. In this video, we are going to talk about what mistakes they tend to make and how we can take advantage of them. These 4 trusted and tested tips will set you up to become a comfortable winner in the low stakes games. Especially the last tip can add quite a bit to your win rate, but it is such an overlooked concept, so make sure to watch until the end. The first hack to win more against recreational players is closely connected to the biggest mistake recreational poker players make. Any idea what that mistake is? Well, almost all recreational players in the world, no matter what stakes they play, no matter whether they play cash games or tournaments, the one thing they have in common is they play way too many hands. Whether they limp a7 offsuit or call a 3-bet out of position with king 10 offsuit, they play a lot more hands than solvers would recommend. So we have to find a way to exploit this. Obviously, one of the best ways to do that is to play strong ranges ourselves. But this is only part of the equation. I don't want to get too technical about this, but you might have heard of the concept of range advantage. Range advantage refers to a situation where one player's potential range of hands is statistically stronger than the opponent's range of hands in a given situation. And yes, I realize that most recreational players don't care about range advantage, but that doesn't mean that you should ignore it. In fact, theory dictates that whenever you have a significant range advantage, you should bet. And now imagine a player who reaches the flop with a much wider range than he is supposed to have. What does that mean? Well, it means that he will connect a lot worse with a random flop than theory would assume. Here's an example. This is what a solver would typically call in the big blind against a middle position open. On a random flop of 9-5 deuce rainbow, around 37% of hands have at least a pair or a gut shot on this flop. Everything else is basically junk. But now, let's look at what a typical recreational player calls with in the same spot. It is a much wider range consisting of basically any suited king, any suited queen, lots of offsuit connected hands like Jack 9, Jack 8, 10 8, and some random suited hands like Jack 6. This range now connects a lot worse with this flop. Only 29% of hands have at least a gut shot or a pair. So how can we take advantage of this? Exploit number 1 is we can continuation bet pretty much our entire range because villain has a lot of junk in their range. You might now say,
But Andreas, my opponents never fold a pair or a gut shot.
well, that's fine. As we said, only 29% of hands connect with this flop. We don't need them to fold a pair, but if they fold all or at least most of their junk, we print money with this bet, even if they will obviously still continue about a third of the time. The second exploit is my favorite one. This one works best in 3-bet pots and against somewhat nitty opponents, but don't try this in Texas or Florida, where people tend to call you down with any pair. But against any opponent who is a bit nittier than that, this one works wonders. And it builds on exploit number 1. In the previous example, we assumed that villain will fold anything that won't connect with a flop. But maybe that was a bit too optimistic. A lot of your recreational villains will still call with ace high, maybe even king high. So they will still show up on the turn with a lot of junk. And even bottom pair or a weak pocket pair won't be an amazing hand by the turn. So here is the actual magic. Exploit number 2 is, if you don't have any showdown value, just barrel the turn. Ideally, barrel quite big. Even a bet that's bigger than the pot could be useful. If villain sits there with ace high or pocket 4s, he will have a very hard time calling. For exploit number 3, we're moving on from bluffs to value hands. But let's say we don't have a massive value hand, but more of a mediocre made hand, like in this example. Let's say we raise in middle position with ace-4 of spades, a recreational player in the big blind calls. The flop comes ace-jack-6 with 2 hearts. This is a somewhat wet board, so many players would want to bet for protection. But you don't really need to protect, or I should rather say you can't protect. Because if he has a flush draw, he will never fold it. And if he has a gut shot, then he has an 8% chance to improve to a straight on the turn, which is a risk I'm willing to take. Against this type of player, I would check this marginal made hand. The reason is that he will tell you on the turn with his action and potential bet sizing if he has anything. If he has a weak ace or even a jack and sometimes a hand like pocket 7s, he will bet the turn because he is afraid of a flush coming. Also, he might just bluff with complete air and then you can bluff catch. You might now say,
But Andreas, in my games, players never bluff.
well, I don't think that is really true. But one thing is true. In live poker, recreational players rarely bluff for a lot of money. So if you see a bet for over $100 at 1-2 or 1-3, then this is much more likely to be for value. And that's exactly why I would check back the flop in our example. Tip number 3 is we check for information because our villain will reveal a lot about his hand if we check. And now on to tip number 4, the one that can really determine whether you're just a small winner or a crusher. Here's an example to show you what most decent live regs do. They raise a hand like King-Jack and they get called by the 2 players in the blinds. The flop comes Ace-Queen-Deuce with 2 hearts. Hero makes a continuation bet, the small blind folds, the big blind calls. He now hits the gin card on the turn. The offsuit 10 gives Hero the nuts. He makes a 2/3 pot bet and gets called again. The river is a total brick. Hero now panics that the opponent might have a missed flush draw, so he bets about half pot. Villain snap calls with ace-jack. The thing is, if villain had a flush draw, then you can bet $5 and he will probably fold. So don't worry about that. You have to try to maximize against his big hands. And yes, I agree that he probably won't have a set and maybe not even 2 pair because he would have probably raised at some point. But recreational players are often inelastic to bet sizing. They either believe you or they don't. And if they think that you have a missed flush draw, then they will call you down no matter what. If you are super deep, then maybe you can't go all in. But if you're 100 or 150 big blinds deep, you can just shove for value in this spot. So tip number 4 is make sure you get the maximum. Exploiting recreational players is only half of what you have to do in order to maximize your winnings though. This strategy made me and many of my students thousands of dollars, and today I'm going to show you exactly how you can copy me and exploit one of the most common mistakes you'll see at 1-2 and 1-3 tables. This strategy is so reliable that once you learn it, you'll actually get excited when opponents make this play against you. And the best part, it's incredibly easy to spot and even easier to exploit. So let's jump right into it. So, what is this mysterious mistake so many players make at the live low stakes? Here's a simple example. A player limps in middle position, we raise on the button, he calls. The flop comes King 9-4 rainbow. This is a spot where the limper should check his entire range to the aggressor because this board hits the aggressor's range well. But that's not how most recreational poker players think. They look at the 9-7 suited in their hand and at the board and they'll think, I have second pair, I'll bet to find out where I'm at. It's like asking, how deep is this pool by jumping in head first? And that's the big mistake many 1-2 and 1-3 live players make. They don't bet in situations where they have absolutely no business doing so. What is a donk bet? It's when a player bets into you when they're not supposed to have the betting lead. Despite the somewhat disrespectful sounding name, it doesn't necessarily mean that players who donk bet are weak. But most of the time, the clue is in the name. It's like a neon sign flashing, exploit me. In my years of coaching and playing live poker, I've noticed that recreational players donk bet for very predictable reasons. They're not making some sophisticated strategic play, they're usually just confused or uncomfortable. Most of the time, when such a player donk bets, they have one of two types of hands. First, they have some kind of a draw. Maybe they called you pre-flop raise with Queen Jack and now they have a gut shot. Or they have a medium strength hand that they're worried about. This can be top pair with a weak kicker, or middle pair, or a middling pocket pair that didn't connect with a flop. Here's what's crucial to understand though. In both scenarios, they don't have a really strong hand. If they flop 2 pair or better, most live poker players would check call to try to trap you. They'd be sitting there with a monster trying to look nonchalant while internally screaming, please bet into me. It's very rare that a typical live low stakes player will start putting a lot of money into the pot when they actually have a massive hand. And if they had complete air, they'd usually just check fold, so we can probably rule that one out as well. And this creates a great opportunity for us because we can now pinpoint quite exactly what they have. All we have to do is to figure out how to exploit this play. So now I'm going to show you a hand that I recently played where I exploited this play mercilessly, and after that I'll show you an example where someone donks and you have to be very careful. So here's the example of how I exploit such a move. The cutoff limped in a 1-2 game. I isolated him to 15 with king-queen offsuit on the button. The limper called. The flop came 9-6 deuce rainbow. The limper now donked 11 into the pot of 33. This is actually not a terrible donk bet because this board does favor the limper's range much more than mine. But I still think that the reason he donked was not that he understood the board texture, but because he probably had either a draw or some weak pair. At this point, I called. He gave me almost 4-1 pot odds. We have position and 2 overcards. I definitely won't fold in this spot, so I called. The turn was a 7, completing the rainbow. This is not a great card for me, and if he has 7-6, now he has 2 pair. If he has 8-7, he now has a pair to go with his open-ended straight draw. And if he bet the flop with 10-8 for a gut shot, he now has a straight. And indeed, he continued betting. This time he made it 17, which in poker body language translates to I still have something, but I'm still not sure what to do with it. If the turn card had favored my perceived range, I could have raised. But because we will never get him to fold 2 pair, a straight, or an open-ended straight draw, I definitely don't want to raise in this spot. If you want to fold at this point, that's fine. I'm pretty sure we don't have the best hand, so folding is okay. However, he is giving us great pot odds.
We only have to be good 23% of the time by the river. And if a king or a queen are live outs, then we have around 12% equity. Plus, we might be able to get some more money on the river if we hit. But the main reason why I called was not because I was hoping to hit a king or a queen. Sure, that would be nice, but my plan was to take this pot away from my opponent like candy from a baby. Because here's the thing, he donked twice quite small. Unless he comes out firing a big bet on the river, he is super capped, which means that he doesn't have anything better than a weak pair. So what's our plan for the river? Well, it depends on the river card and on what he does, of course. If we river a king or a queen, we'll either call a small bet of his, or if he checks, then we'll go for value ourselves. If the river is a blank card and he checks, we can bet big and represent an overpair. If the river pairs the 6 or the 10, then we would probably just give up. And if the river is an overcard like an ace or a queen, we can possibly get away with a medium-sized bet to get him to fold. In this example, the river was a 3, so a complete blank. He checked and I bet 105 into the pot of 89. And yes, sure, there will be players who will snap you off with a 6. But there will be others who will fold top pair. Because look at our line from his point of view. We raised big pre-flop. We called his flop bet. We called his turn bet, and now we're over betting the river. Even an inexperienced live player will understand that your line screams strength louder than a fire alarm. In this example, my opponent actually tanked for about 2 minutes. He kept saying that he can only beat a bluff, which ironically was of course exactly what he was facing. Sometimes poker players are more accurate than they realize. And in the end, he folded. I congratulated him to make him feel good about the fold while stacking my chips. I know that in some games against really weak players in Texas, Florida or other states, nobody would ever fold top pair. But even then, this play can be successful because they then fold all weaker pairs. And if a small overbet doesn't do the job in your games, then maybe go twice the size of the pot. But you don't even always have to overbet the river to pull off the heist. Most of the time, you can take the pot away with much smaller investments, like in this example. Let's say you raise pre-flop with ace-king, get called by the big blind, and the flop comes jack 8-3 rainbow. Your opponent donk bets half pot. Even though you completely missed this flop, you can raise now. Why does this work? Because your opponent is probably betting with something like jack 9, pocket sixes, or maybe a draw like 10-9. When you raise, they're put in an awful spot. They know you raise pre-flop, so you could easily have ace-jack, king-jack, an overpair, or even a set. Many opponents will just fold, giving you the pot immediately. And what if they call? Well, then a fairly big bet on the turn often gets the job done. And you might not even have to bluff, because you might hit an ace or a king on the turn. But I have another strategy that I like even better than this one. You can just call the flop. If he bets small on a brick turn again, now you can raise. And if he checks, you now bet close to pot. This play looks so strong that most of your opponents will fold a mediocre hand. But earlier I promised to show you when you shouldn't attack donk bets. Here's an example. A tight player raises in the cutoff. A fish in the small blind calls. We have king-jack suited in the big blind and we call. The flop comes queen 7-5 rainbow. The small blind donked for 2/3 pot. And this is the situation where calling or raising would be a mistake. Why? Well, there are a few reasons. Number one, villain donked quite big. It wasn't the usual third pot bet, but he went 2/3 pot. This indicates that he might have a stronger hand. 2. The pot is multi-way. Even a smaller donk bet in a multi-way pot is often a stronger hand because most players understand that their middle pair isn't that strong if there are multiple opponents involved in the hand. And 3. There is a tight player to act behind us. He might have an overpair or top pair, so if we put more money in, not only do we have to bluff the fish in the small blind, but we also have to dodge a big hand from the original raiser. Therefore, in this spot, the best course of action by far is to fold. So be aware of donk bets in multi-way pots, and if they bet around pot or bigger even in heads-up pots. Those bets tend to mean that they have a stronger hand. But a small donk bet from your typical live low stakes player in a heads-up pot is one of the most reliable profit sources in live low stakes poker. They're essentially putting up a sign that says I'm not sure about my hand strength, and that gives you a massive opportunity to apply pressure and win pots.
Phew, this was a long one. Are you ready to graduate now? In this last module, you'll learn specific skills that will boost your win rate, and we'll start with 10 things good players do that bad ones don't.
Poker isn't just a card game, it's a battle of wits, strategy, and nerves. And what separates the sharks from the wannabe sharks? It's certainly not just luck. It is the way they approach the game. And in this video, I'm breaking down 10 things good poker players do that bad ones don't. These are the habits and strategies that could transform your game if you pay close attention. My name is Andreas Wagner, I'm a live poker coach, and I used to be one of these wannabe sharks before I started doing these 10 things. The first thing is actually super easy to do, but the vast majority of live poker players somehow seems allergic to doing it. Would you like to see an example? Say someone raises in early position to 10 in a 1-2 game, there are a couple of callers, and you hold 10-9 offsuit in the small blind. What do you do in this spot? Well, I'll tell you what fish and wannabe sharks do. They call. And what do sharks do? They have an easy fold. It's a multi-way pot. They have a bad hand, are out of position, and the price is quite high. This is a league that many players have, both pre-flop and post-flop. They are just way too loose and hope to somehow get lucky. The quickest way to improve your long-term poker results is to follow this one piece of advice, because this is one of the things good players do. Fold more often, especially in multi-way pots. The next one is probably an equally big bankroll killer, and this one is a bit trickier to avoid, but it's certainly not impossible. Say our hero did call the 10-9 offsuit in the small blind, the flop comes 10-9 deuce with 2 spades. The pre-flop aggressor just recklessly shoves all in on the flop. All the other players fold and hero snap calls. The original raiser turns over pocket aces. Hero is thrilled, but only until the river card comes, because that is another deuce and his 2 pair are now counterfeit. A good player doesn't care about the outcome of this hand. He got his money in when he was a 73% favorite. This means he is printing money with this call, so he's very happy even though he just lost a big pot. A weak player will go on tilt after that, chase his losses and make reckless decisions. He will be fuming and complaining to the poker gods about his bad luck, and later he might dust off his entire stack, while good players know how to manage their emotions. The next difference between good and not so good players is a bread and butter exploit really, but something a lot of players will miss. Here's another quick example. Hero raises to 10 with ace-king in a 1-2 game, both blinds call. The flop comes queen 7-5. Hero goes for a Cbet and the big blind calls. The turn is a deuce. Hero fires again, big blind calls again. The river is another deuce. Hero goes for the triple barrel bluff, big blind thinks for about 2 seconds and calls. Villain scoops the pot with 9-7 suited for second pair, weak kicker. Maybe Hero's triple barrel was a bit optimistic, but that's not what we want to discuss here. The interesting bit is the next hand between these exact 2 same players, only about 15 minutes later. Now Hero raises again, this time with Jack-10 suited in the cutoff. The same villain calls. This time he's in the small blind. The flop comes Jack-7-4. Hero C-bets, villain calls. The turn is a 5. Hero bets again, villain calls again. And the river is an inconsequential 3. Both players check and Hero wins the pot. Do you think that this was all standard fare?
then I'm sorry to say it, but you're not quite a crusher if you think so. If we didn't know anything about our opponent, I would say this is absolutely standard to go for 2 barrels and then check back the river because the bet is getting too thin. However, we learned in the previous hand that villain calls down a triple barrel with second pair no kicker. So when we have top pair, we have to go for value, and that's what the best players do. They adapt to their opponents. It takes experience to get to this level to be able to exploit players' tendencies, but this next one is really easy to do, even for novices. Except many players still don't do it. I recently asked my viewers how long their longest live poker session was. 36% of the respondents said that they had played sessions longer than 12 hours. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with that, but what I do see all the time is that players who have been playing for 12 or 16 or even 20 hours will almost be falling asleep at the table. Those players can't be on their A game, and it's not only about being tired, but the same is true for being tilted or just simply not at their best because they had an argument or they are worrying about unpaid bills. And yet so many players will continue playing under these circumstances. Good players, however, know when to quit. Off to the next one. Recently, I got sent a hand that was played in a 1-1 game. There was a huge raise to 20 big blinds, which apparently is quite normal in this game. Hero 3-bet his pocket kings to 50, and then the button cold 4-bet to 125. A cold 4-bet for such a size would definitely deploy my alarm bells, but after the original razor folds, I would call in this spot. Hero did just that, so that's fine. The flop comes ace 9-4, both players check. The turn is a break. Hero now bets really small. I would prefer to see a check here once again, but I don't think this is terrible. Villain calls. The river is a 10. Hero now goes all in and gets snapped off by pocket aces. This river bet is an absolute disaster. If I had asked Hero why he bet here, he probably wouldn't have been able to give me a satisfying answer. Why? Because there is no reason for this bet. In poker, there are only 2 reasons to bet on the river. A, to get a better hand to fold, and B, to get a worse hand to call. That's it. In this example, I can't see a single better hand that would fold, and I can't see a single worse hand that would call. But a lot of players will panic and will start betting because they think that they have the best hand after the flop went check-check. I will say that this hero is actually a good player, very keen to improve and a hard worker, definitely a winning player at this level. And still, he fell for this because he couldn't make the right judgment in the moment. He forgot what normally makes him a crusher. Bet with a purpose. Earlier I showed you the hand where a player triple barreled and got called by a guy with second pair no kicker. As I said, I'm not going to judge whether that was a good or a bad play from either player in this exact hand. But this brings me to a more important point for live low stakes poker. There are rumors out there that a player should fight for every single pot. Poker coaches and YouTube creators talk about battling in this context. And I understand the logic behind that. They say that you should battle to win small pots, medium pots, big pots, and that is all well and good. But live low-stakes poker often doesn't work like that. If, like in the example, you have a player who calls down 3 barrels with second pair, then what's the point in trying to bluff him? Or if you're in a 5-way pot and you have a gut shot, do you really need to go for the check raise on the turn after a player bet big on the flop and the turn? At low stakes, you have to be value oriented, and good players know that. They don't mindlessly fight for every pot out there. And this next one is quite similar, but I think it is very important to mention as well. I once played in a really good game. There were 6 really splashy recreational players giving away their money left and right. And then there were a wannabe shark and me. I had position on 2 of the biggest whales, which was a great scenario for me. But it also meant that the wannabe shark was set to my left. So what would often happen was that a couple of the whales would limp, I would raise, and then the wannabe shark 3-bet me big.
The whales were frustrated and folded, and I ended up playing 3-bet pots against the wannabe shark, where sometimes I would 4-bet and then he would fold. Can you see the irony here? Those whales wanted to see flops and splash around with their money, but they were frustrated because they basically couldn't play a hand. And the good players battled for the pots with tiny edges while the whales were twiddling their thumbs, until at some point 2 of them had enough and just left. This reg declared war on me because I raised the weaker players, and what it meant was that neither he nor I won any money in that session because of that. What would a smart player have done instead? He would have overcalled a lot more to play pots in position against the weakest players at the table, even if it meant going multi-way to the flop. The reason? He would focus on profitable spots rather than getting involved in ego battles. The next one is more of a meta consideration, and this is all about consistency. It is a word that I don't really like because it is quite vague, but bear with me. A lot of wannabe sharks will be quite enthusiastic when they start studying poker. They will see their results improve significantly after only a few sessions of studying. They are highly motivated to make this hobby a sustainable one, so they study and they play. But then they hit a rough patch. They run their kings into aces, they have their own aces cracked by some lunatic who called a 3-bet out of position with 6-4 offsuit. Don't do that. And then they tilt their stack away by shoving Jack-10 offsuit over a 4-bet. Their entire motivation goes away after this. They stop playing for a while and they just don't take it as seriously anymore. Real crushers, on the other hand, have a very different approach. They continue on their path even when things get tough. They keep studying and play through difficult times. They keep this consistency. And they do something else that's extremely important. I don't know if you watched my video about dopamine loading. If you haven't, you should definitely check it out. I will leave a link in the description below so that you can watch it after this one. Now, I'm not saying that they do the exact thing I suggested in that video, but what they do is they are ready for what's to come. And by that, I mean that they put themselves into a calm state whenever they play poker. Poker will mess with your emotions enough. You don't need to bring even more emotions to the table. Good players won't play poker after a big argument with their spouse, or when they're worried about paying the rent or awaiting a diagnosis from a doctor. They leave their baggage outside the poker room. So far, I have used examples of what other players did wrong, but now I will show on my own example how not to act. My example is from chess, but it fully translates to poker. I really like playing chess, but I'm a total fish when it comes to chess. I play the game online sometimes to wind down, just like many recreational players play poker. And then I make the most stupid mistakes. I lose my queen because I don't realize that I left her unprotected, or I just focus on attacking and then my opponent sets me checkmate at my end. These mistakes are annoying, but I keep repeating them and I'm just not getting better at chess. And why is that? Because I don't care to learn. I don't take the game seriously enough. I only play it for fun. And I think that that is totally okay as long as I don't go about complaining about it. But if you're serious about any game, be it chess or poker or anything in life really, then you have to study and learn from your mistakes. When I play poker, I go home and check what a solver would have done in a similar situation to the one that cost me my entire stack. Or I fire up Flopzilla to double check what an opponent's range is in a given spot. If you want to improve at poker, these are the processes you have to follow. Because crushers review hands, they study strategies, and they learn from their mistakes. They learn from every session. Be honest, how many of these things would you have known? It's not a shame if your game isn't there yet as long as you keep studying.
Most poker players Cbet way too much or not nearly enough. Either way, they're bleeding money without even realizing it. But what if I told you there is an easy way to fix this? In this video, I'll teach you a few simple shortcuts to Cbet properly so you can stop making costly mistakes and start winning more pots with less effort. My name's Andreas Wagner and I'm the author of the ebook Cbet Mastery, which by the way you can get completely for free. Yep, that's right, completely free. No gimmicks, no hidden fees. The link is in the description below. First, let's quickly define what a continuation bet or Cbet actually is. A Cbet is when the player who raised pre-flop continues by betting on the flop. Simple enough, right? But here's where most players mess up. There are three big mistakes I see all the time. One, C-betting every single time, no matter what. This is a surefire way to burn money, especially on boards that don't favor your range. Here's an example. You raise pre-flop, the button calls. The flop comes 8-7-6 with 2 spades. This is a spot where so many players will C-bet, but it is a big mistake, as we will see. Why? Because this board is what I like to call a landmine. One wrong step and boom, your win rate is gone. Mistake number 2, only C-betting when you hit. In some loose and splasher games, this might be a viable strategy because nobody is paying attention and players will still pay you off. But if you play against better players, this makes you way too predictable and good players will crush you for it. It's like only bluffing when you're holding a banana in your hand. People will catch on fast. And number 3, using big bet sizes just to protect your hand. If you're just trying to protect your hand, you're thinking about C-betting all wrong. Protection isn't the main goal of C-betting. There are 3 reasons for betting in general, and this applies to C-betting as well. 1, to get a weaker hand to call. 2, to get a better hand to fold. And 3, to deny equity. Always think about which of these 3 reasons you want to accomplish. And you need to think about position, range advantage, and the board texture as well. So, how do you fix these mistakes? Let's break it down. The first thing to focus on is when to C-bet and when to check. And the key to this is understanding position and range advantage. If you're in position and you have the range advantage, you can C-bet close to 100% of the time. That means betting with your strong hands, your medium strength hands, your draws, and even total air. For example, say you raise an early position, the big blind calls, and the flop comes King 7 deuce. This is a great spot to C-bet almost everything because your range is much stronger than your opponent's. Out of position, it's the complete opposite. If you're out of position and don't have the range advantage, you should mostly be checking. Let's say you raise under the gun and the button calls. The flop is 10-8-6 rainbow. This is an absolute nightmare spot for you. The button's range connects way better with this board than yours does, and you're out of position. Here, you should pretty much check your entire range. And look, I don't want to make this about solvers and game theory optimal play or GTO, because let's be honest, in live poker nobody plays GTO. I mean, the guy in seat 4 just check raised all in with pocket 3s on a board full of overcards. Do you really think he's running PioSolver on his lunch break? But ironically, both GTO ranges and the range of your typical live opponent connect extremely well with this board. So the first big takeaway is, in position, bet aggressively. Out of position, slow down. Obviously, this is a massive simplification, but you will likely improve your results simply by following this advice. Now let's talk about how much to bet. The best C-bet size depends on 4 things. Position, are you in or out of position? Range advantage, who has the stronger overall range? Nut advantage, who is more likely to have the absolute best hand, and range connectivity. How well does each player's range hit the board? And here I would like to introduce a C-betting flowchart. I believe Jonathan Little was the first poker coach to introduce this concept publicly, and it's so simple that even your uncle who still thinks poker is all about reading tells could use it. The idea is that you ask a series of questions. The first question is, do I have the range advantage? If the answer is no and you still want to bet, you C-bet big, something like 2/3 pot. And remember, here we're not deciding whether to C-bet, only what size to use after we have determined that we want to C-bet. When we don't have the range advantage, we will indeed often elect to check, but when we bet big. If the answer to the question about the range advantage is yes, then we have more questions to ask. Do we have the nut advantage? If the answer is no and we still want to c-bet, then we go small. Small means around third pot. If the answer is yes, then we have yet another question to ask. How well does our opponent's range connect with this flop? Here we are basically looking at whether a fairly big portion of his range will have hit this board. And hitting can mean a pair, but it can also mean a flush draw or a straight draw. So, for example, if we raise from early position and the big blind calls, if the flop is King 7 deuce rainbow, the connectivity will be low for our opponent. Yes, he might have a king or a 7 or even a deuce, but he also has Queen Jack suited, 9-8 suited, Queen 9 suited, Ace Jack offsuit. Whereas if in the same scenario the flop is 10-8-5 with 2 clubs, then it is a very different picture. The majority of his range will have either a pair or a flush draw or at least a gut shot. Only few hands miss this flop completely, and those hands would be primarily overcards. So back to the flowchart. If his range connectivity with a board is low, then once again we choose the small c-bet size. And if it is high, then we choose the big size. Following this simple decision tree will make sure you're using the right bet sizes at the right times. So to c-bet properly, remember these 3 things. 1. Don't autopilot. Adjust based on position and board texture. 2. In position, c-bet aggressively. Out of position, be more cautious. 3. Choose your bet sizes wisely. Bigger isn't always better. But there is an even simpler way of choosing when to c-bet and what size to use. I cover this easy hack in my free ebook Cbet Mastery. And I also talk about c-betting in multi-way pots, 3-bet pots, and how to play the turn after a c-bet. There you will also get the c-betting flowchart so you can study it in your own time. Just click the link in the description below. And if you want another simple hack to improve your win rate fast, then I would recommend using Daniel Negreanu's golden rule. There is one skill that wins the really big money in live low stakes poker. And I'm not talking about thin value betting or bluffing or knowing when to fold on the river. It is something that goes much deeper than that. It is the one skill that truly separates the crushers from the mere winners and the losers. So in today's video, you will learn what this magical mystery skill actually is and how you can use it to boost your bankroll. And I'll show you, using one of my most painful poker memories, how I went from being clueless and leaving the card room with a broken ego to taking home the big pots. I vividly remember the biggest pot in big blinds I've ever lost in my life. It was in 2018 when I thought I had figured out live poker. Spoiler alert, I really hadn't. The Hippodrome in London, where I used to play most of my hours at the time, introduced a new deep stack format. The blinds were still 1-2, but you could buy in with as much money as you wanted. So naturally, in my I'm a crusher mode, I bought in for £1,000, aka 500 big blinds. I sat down and after half an hour, I had King Queen of spades, a nice suited Broadway. A guy in the hijack, who also had £1,000 in front of him, raised to £10 and I 3-bet to £35 on the button, but he now 4-bet to £120. Normally, I'd consider folding this hand, but because we were so deep and I had position, I thought I'd call, so I did. The flop comes Jack of spades, 9 of spades, Deuce of hearts. Great flop for me, I thought, confidently, like a man walking into a trap wearing a blindfold. The guy c-bet for around half pot. At this point, I just called. There was almost £500 in the middle and we had around £750 behind when the 7 of spades came on the turn. Bingo! I got him now, I thought to myself. And to my excitement, he now bets £300 and I can't raise all in fast enough, only to get snap called. As the river was an inconsequential 4 of diamonds, we both turned over our cards and he showed ace-10 of spades for the absolute nuts. And there it was. I had just lost 500 big blinds. Poof, gone, my entire stack. I ended up that session with a loss of £2,104 in 7 hours. It was the most brutal day of poker I've ever had. So what happened in this ominous hand? Did I get coolered? Well, I definitely got unlucky that I had the second nut flush and he had the nut flush. If we had played in a tournament and were 40 big blinds deep, this would definitely be considered a cooler. In a 100 big blinds deep cash game, you could still kind of say this is fine, but here we were 500 big blinds deep, and I butchered this hand so badly that even the deck felt sorry for me. In a minute I'm going to show you how I should have played this hand, but first let's now talk about the skill that wins all the money in live poker, unless you're me in 2018, in which case not having it sets your bankroll on fire. It is deep stack play. When the stacks get deep, both the profit and the losses get big as well. So if you regularly find yourself playing in games where most players have more than 200 big blinds in front of them, you need to have good deep stack skills. Otherwise, the losses will compound. If you make a mistake when you're 20 big blinds deep, you only lose peanuts. But when you have 500 bigs in front of you, this could be the money for your rent or mortgage. So let's see how I should have played the hand with king-queen suited. I still think that 3-betting the hand in position is absolutely fine, but the big mistake that I made was to call his 4-bet. That's where the wheels fell off really. It's not even the fact that he made it almost 4 times my raise, the bigger issue is that I can be dominated in this spot. If the flop comes, say, king 6-6 and villain keeps piling money into the pot, I am in a really tough spot. And king queen has an additional problem. It almost never makes the nuts. It usually makes the second nut flush, like in this example, and even on a board like king queen queen, there is always a chance in a 4-bet pot that villain has a bigger boat with pocket kings. That's why one of the most important skills in deep stack games is to recognize which hands to play pre-flop. Hands that can make the nuts or close to it. What are these? Suited aces and to some extent pocket pairs. Suited aces will always draw to the nut flush, so I would rather have ace-4 suited than ace-jack offsuit when super deep. The pairs will not always be the nuts, but even when you're 200 big blinds deep, it is okay to go broke with middle set. This changes when you are even deeper though. Suited aces are still great, in fact they are even better now. But pairs are now dangerous, especially smaller ones. Let's look at this example a student of mine once played. A player in early position raised to 15 in a 1-2 game where both villain and our hero had around $1,000 in front of them. My student called with pocket 5s in the cutoff and the big blind also called. The flop came king 5 deuce. The original raiser Cbet, my student raised, the big blind folded and the original raiser re-raised now. My student called. The turn was a jack and now the original raiser bet again, my student called again. The river was an ace, villain jammed. My student snap called. Villain unsurprisingly showed down pocket kings. As I said, for up to 200 big blinds it is okay to go broke with a set against another set. But when you're playing super deep stack, like in this example, small and medium pocket pairs can be really dangerous. One other adjustment you need to make when deep is how you handle 3-bets. If your opponent is a strong, aggressive player, calling with small pocket pairs or speculative hands can be risky as they will apply constant pressure. However, against tight opponents who only 3-bet big pairs like jacks, queens, kings and aces and ace-king, calling with small pairs becomes much more profitable. These are the players who will struggle the most in deep stack situations because they only know how to play one way, tight and predictable. But again, if you flop bottom set and they are the ones making big bets on every street, you have to be careful. But there is one other way how you can make the big bucks in deep stack games. This is the most important skill that the best pros have. Whenever you see one of the really good vloggers out there like Gaziby, Ben Bedbeat or Margoon stack lots of chips, it is usually because of this one skill. Here's a hand I played recently where I put this into practice. A very tight player raised to 12 in a 1-3 game. The hijack, who is not a great player, called and I called behind with ace-4 of diamonds. The big blind also called. I had around 340 big blinds in front of me, the original raiser and the big blind covered me. We went 4 ways to a flop of 9-4 deuce with 2 diamonds, giving me middle pair and a nut flush draw. The original raiser Cbet to only 15, the next player to act folded. I decided to just call here and take my equity, the big blind folded as well. The turn was an offsuit jack and villain now bet 50. I raised to 175, he called. The river was an offsuit 7. He checked to me and I shoved my remaining stack of around 500 into the pot of 430. He tanked for a while and then folded his pocket queens face up. It was a risky move on my side, but a profitable one against tight players who don't feel comfortable calling down an overbet with just a pair when we are so deep. Crushers know how to exploit tight players by playing ultra aggressive and putting their entire stack at risk. This strategy requires experience and a strong stomach, but it is extremely profitable once you master it. Deep stack poker is where the biggest edges appear for skilled players who understand post-flop play. Nits and overly tight players struggle in these situations because they are unwilling to adapt their strategy. They'll play solid poker for hours until they finally get stacked when they can't fold an overpair against your disguised straight or set. If you understand these concepts and adjust your play accordingly, you'll be the one raking in those massive pots while your opponents wonder how you keep getting lucky. But most of the time you won't be playing super deep stacked poker, but maybe only 150 big blinds deep against your typical recreational player at a 1-2 or 1-3 table.
Do you want to crush the live low-stakes games in your casino? Then there are 2 things you have to do. You have to play fundamentally strong poker yourself without making any silly mistakes, and you have to adjust to the mistakes your opponents are making. Today I'm going to teach you a simplified strategy that I normally share with my paying clients. So in this video I will show you how to approach continuation betting in live poker, how to avoid playing a lot of multi-way pots, and I will give you my top tip for playing multi-way pots if you can't get it heads up. Let's get started. Okay, so continuation betting the flop is one of the most talked about features in poker. In fact, I have just written a small ebook about it. If you want to get it for free, click in the link in the description below. Anyway, different textures, different sizes, being in position or out of position, range advantage, nut advantage. There are so many factors to consider and your head is probably already spinning. All these factors are indeed important when you play against better players. But the thing is, after years of playing live poker and experimenting with all sorts of strategies, I have realized that in live low-stakes poker, there is actually an easier approach to flop c-betting. Here is how I simplify flop c-betting when I'm up against a recreational player. Say we open ace of hearts, 9 of clubs in the cutoff, and big blind calls. The flop is 8-6 deuce with 2 diamonds and a heart. A solver says to check 30% of the time with his hand, bet small 35% of the time, bet half pot 33% of the time, and even have some bigger bets. But quite frankly, I don't care. There are 3 things recreational players tend to do. 1, they will raise their good hands and best draws. 2, they will fold to a c-bet if they have nothing. And 3, they will overstab with all sorts of nonsense after we check. So if we check here, then there is a good chance that the big blind will bet on the turn with a hand like Queen 10 just because we checked. And then we would have to go on a bluff catching mission. But if we bet, he will raise his big hand so we can find an easy follow. And if he calls, then we know that he probably doesn't have a set or 2 pairs because he would have raised those out of fears of getting sucked out. This gives us the option to blast him off his medium strength hand later. And now let's look at a spot where we are out of position. This time we raise pocket queens and get called by the button. The flop is jack 6 deuce rainbow. If we bet now, he will fold a hand like 8-7 suited or ace 4 suited. But if we check, we give him a chance to stab with those hands. And he will probably even stab with pocket 5s. So here I prefer to just check and then go for a check raise if he bets. And what if we don't have anything? Say we have a hand like 8-7 suited ourselves. Well, if we don't even have a backdoor flush draw, then it is okay to just check fold. It's unlikely that we are ahead of whatever he has, and that is not a hand to try to fight with. And it's okay to sometimes just check fold. Poker is not about winning every single hand, but about making as few mistakes as possible. So the simplified flop c-betting strategy in heads-up pots against recreational players is check your entire range out of position and bet your entire range in position. It's as simple as that. Depending on the opponent and your reads, you can sometimes deviate from this, but I would start with this strategy as a default. At this point, I hear you say,
"But Andreas, this is all well and good, but in my games we rarely have a heads-up pot. All the flops go multi-way."
that is a valid point. And that's why I'm now going to show you how you can avoid that. Sure, if you raise under the gun, it will be difficult to avoid a multi-way pot, but if you are in later position, then it should be much easier. Usually, there will be two main ways of how the action will unfold. Either there will be a bunch of limps, or there will be a raise and maybe a call or two. Let's look at both scenarios. Say we have ace-10 offsuit in the cutoff, and there are 3 limps to us. Your worst option here is to limp behind. That would be terrible, actually. The second worst option is to raise to something like $12. Everyone will probably call you, including the cocktail waitress. That's why you have to go absurdly big. $20 is the bare minimum. I will make it $25. This should either get you heads up or you just take down the pot. But the second scenario is the more interesting one. Say now LowJack raises to $10 and Hijack calls. Again, the worst option by far would be to call behind. I'd much rather fold than call behind here. But the best play in this spot is to squeeze. I would make it around $40. And if this is the kind of game where nobody folds to 3-bets, then tighten up a bit and go bigger. Make it $50 or $60. And what hand should you 3-bet with? Contrary to what GTO solvers would suggest, I would 3-bet a good linear range. Good pairs, good ace-x hands, king-queen, some suited broadways and suited connectors. If you get everyone to fold, then that's great. And if you get a caller, that's still fine. You have position, you have a skill edge, and you should have a better range of hands. So if you want to avoid multi-way pots, 3-bet aggressively with a linear range in late position. But as I said, it's not always possible to avoid multi-way pots, so we still have to know how to play them. The general advice is to be fairly honest and not bluff much, because someone is likely to have something. And that is generally a sound strategy. The other advice you often hear is to bet small in multi-way pots. And that is generally okay. But today I would like to show you a different approach. Here's an example. We raise pocket 9s under the gun and almost everyone calls. Even the people playing roulette in the next room seem to call. The flop comes ace-jack 9 rainbow. If I had a hand like king-queen, I would just fold. If I had a hand as strong as ace-king, I might also just check, or I would indeed bet small. But with pocket 9s, I will bet big. There are about 1 million players in this hand. It is quite likely that someone will have an ace. And an ace is never folding, no matter if I go quarter pot or almost full pot. And then there are hands like queen 10, 10-8, 10-7, king queen, and so on, that won't want to fold. Not to mention if someone has 2 pairs. And even a naked jack might sometimes call. So just bet on the bigger side and keep betting big if the turn is a brick.
But Andreas, isn't our strategy totally transparent if we always bet big with our nuts, bet small with medium strength hands, and check with bad hands?
I hear you ask. Yes, we are. Absolutely. And who cares? I don't. If you play against good pros, then you have to be more careful, of course. But the thing is, good pros don't usually play lots of multi-way pots. And the typical 1-2 or 1-3 player won't fold top pair because last time you bet big you had a set. He probably didn't even notice it because he was busy ordering his next beer. So just play your hand and don't worry about balance. Do you want to improve your live poker and make 2025 your best year yet? Then this is exactly the video for you, because today I'm going to show you 4 quick fixes to some of the most common leaks I regularly see among ambitious players like my students. If you fix these 4 leaks, you can become a crusher at live low-stakes poker. Especially the last one is so costly that I would probably be able to buy a Lamborghini from all the money I would have saved over the years if I had avoided this mistake. But this first mistake is also one that compounds over time, and most players don't even notice it. Here's an example of what I mean. You play in a 1-2 game. There is a limp and another limp. You look down at ace-jack offsuit and you raise for value to $12. The small blind, who only has $80 left, now jams. The limpers both fold. What do you do in this spot with your ace-jack offsuit? Well, it depends on what we think the small blind jamming range is. That would be the right answer. But what most players do is automatically flick in that call. The thinking goes, it's only $68 more and we have a good ace. Sure, he might have a big pocket pair, but even if we get so unlucky, I won't lose much. And this is wrong. Here's my 3-step process that I go through in this spot. First of all, I need to figure out what the equity is that we need. So in the pot, there is his $80, our $12, plus $6 from the big blind and the limpers. But let's say the limpers and the big blind pay for the rake, so that leaves $92 in the pot. We have to call $68 to win the 92 plus our 68, which totals $160. This means that we need 42.5% equity in this spot. Okay, step 2 is to figure out what range villain might jam with. This is more of an art than a science because we don't know, but let's assume he would do this with pocket 8s and better, as well as ace-king and ace-queen, and we'll also give him king-queen suited. And now, step 3 is to determine what equity our ace-jack offsuit has against that range. This is hard to do at the table, but you can do it easily off the table to train your muscle. If we plug the data into Flopzilla, we see that our equity is just 32%. But we need 42.5%, so we would be losing $17 with this call. And what if we have ace-queen offsuit? Then we'd have 38% equity, which is still not enough. Only ace-king has more equity than the minimum needed, and pocket 10s would be the weakest pocket pair to call with. So do yourself a favor and think next time before you mindlessly call small all-ins. But off to the next mistake. Here we have ace-queen offsuit in the cutoff. Early position raises to $10, the players in between fold. What would you do in this spot? If you're like most players, you'll say call. You don't feel like ace-queen is strong enough to 3-bet against an early position raise, but it feels too good to fold. But calling is a terrible option. Against a big raise of 5 big blinds and with a typical live rake structure, this call would cost you a big blind long-term in GTO territory. And if you now tell me that the early position raiser is a weak player and you have a skill edge, then I would ask, then why don't you just 3-bet him? Take the initiative, put more money in with a good hand in position, and get everyone behind you to fold their non-premium hands. And this is a crucial aspect. Imagine you just call, and the button and the big blind call because they feel priced in. You are now playing a full-way pot as monkey in the middle with a hand that plays terribly multi-way. Even on a flop of ace-8 deuce, you're never comfortable if the other players put a lot of money into the pot post-flop. So if you want to level up your game quickly, eliminate almost all calls from your game in any position except for the big blind. Play a 3-bet or fold strategy as a default. The only exception is hands that play well multi-way like pocket pairs and suited aces. The third tip is not a mistake as such, but more something that you could optimize. This is something that every seasoned online player knows, but in live poker I rarely see this move at small stakes. Here's an example of a hand as it is typically played at 1-2. You open ace-jack offsuit, you really seem to like this hand, for $10 in the cutoff. Only the big blind calls. The big blind is not a great player, he is a bit on the nittier side, but not terrible either. The flop comes 8, 6, deuce, rainbow. It's not a great board for you, but you decide to continuation bet for a half pot in the hope that villain folds. But the plan doesn't work, he calls. There's now just over $40 in the middle, the turn is a king. This is a good card for your perceived range. You now bet $20 again. He calls again. The river is another deuce. Villain checks again, and you give up. Villain shows down 9-8 offsuit and wins the pot of $80. Here's how you should play against this type of opponent. On the flop, you can still make your half pot bet, that's fine. But on the turn, when the king comes, you have two options. You can either go with a half pot bet again, or you can take out the big hammer and bet $60. That's right, it's 1.5 times the pot. Your opponent will likely be confused, and when players are confused, they make mistakes. It is likely that he will now just fold his mediocre pair. And if he calls, well, then you can overbet the river again. And what if you just go half pot on the turn and he calls? Then you can take out the really big hammer on the river. There's $80 in the pot. You can now bet $200. A nitty player would basically never call such a huge bet with just a pair of eights. And if you know that you're up against a player who just can't follow the medium pair, then you don't bluff, but you still use overbets. When you have a good top pair or better, you now go for the big hammer. But either way, start using overbets to confuse your opponents at live low stakes. They will not know how to react to them. Okay, and now to my favorite one, the one that cost me the Lamborghini. But before we get to that, can I please ask you to smash that like button for me and subscribe to the channel? Thank you. Right,
So this is the Lamborghini hand.
here we raise pocket kings to $15 over a limper when we are in the small blind. The big blind calls and also the limper calls. The flop is an amazing king 7-4 with 2 diamonds. We have top set and we bet 2/3 pot. Big blind folds, but the limper calls. The turn is an offsuit 5. We now bet $70 into the pot of 105. Villain calls again. By the way, if you use my strategy from the previous point, you could overbet to something like $150 here for value. But as played, there is now $245 in the pot. The river brings in the jack of diamonds, completing the flush. It's a very annoying card. We just check now. Villain now bets $200. Looks like a gross spot, but this is actually the easiest fold in the world. Yes, we have top set. Yes, we only need to be good 31% of the time. But the thing is, we are close to 0% good in this spot. Let's rewind the hand. Villain limped into the pot, suggesting that he is passive. He called our ISO raise, he called on the flop, he called on the turn, and now he bets big on the river when the flush comes in. Could he do this with a weaker hand than ours? We can't rule it out completely, but I think that if he had a hand like the set or 2 pair, he would have been more likely to raise on the flop or the turn, because he would have been afraid of the flush. But now that the flush came in, do you think he would start betting his bottom set for a lot of money? I doubt it. Okay, so if he doesn't do this for value with a weaker hand, then what is our hand now? A bluff catcher. Yes, it was the nuts on the flop, it was the effective nuts on the turn, and now on the river it is a bluff catcher. It has been downgraded. It sucks, yes, but that's what it is. We can't magically change this. So if we want to win this pot at showdown, it means that villain has to have a bluff in this pot. If you can tell me 3 bluff hands that make sense, I'd put you forward for the Poker Nobel Prize. I can't think of a single bluff hand. So our set of kings is now a fold. And the Lamborghini mistake is to call big river bets with a bluff catcher. At live low-stakes poker, recreational players severely underbluff the river for a lot of money. Keep that in mind and act accordingly. And one day, you might get out of your own Lamborghini. But in all seriousness, if you want to take your win rate even further, then there are 3 overlooked things that you absolutely have to do. There are 3 hands in poker that most players are very excited to see, but in the games you play, those hands can be catastrophic. Not because they are bad hands, but because you play them the wrong way. I have played live poker for almost a decade, and I only realized this about a year ago or so, so chances are that you still make these mistakes. But this will change after today, because in this video, I will show you what these 3 hands are, why they are problematic, and what the easy solution is to make these hands profitable rather than losing money with them. Let's jump right into them. So this was the exact hand that opened my eyes. I was sitting in a 1-3 game, the straddle was on, and I was in the big blind with pocket queens. The player under the gun raised to 15, which is quite standard in these games. Hijack called, cutoff called. And then the older gentleman in the small blind squeezed to 65 pounds. Now, this guy is not your typical old man coffee type of player who only plays the nuts, but he's definitely not a maniac either. I'd say he's a typical recreational player, basically. Him squeezing in this spot can mean ace-king, pocket jacks, maybe even ace-queen, and of course aces, kings, and queens. So how do we feel about our queens? Well, quite frankly, it is already a bit marginal. But as you can see, queens are still a tiny favorite against a range of jacks plus, ace-queen plus, so going for the cold 4-bet is fine. That's what I did. I made it 140 to go. The other players all folded except for the small blind. He now jammed for a total of 600. When I played this hand, I just couldn't fold. I got married to my queens, which is why I once created this funny picture. It is actually original footage of my wedding. I called, and of course I was shown pocket aces. At the time, I kind of thought, well, I got unlucky. It was blind versus blind, aces versus queens. That's happened. And when I played online poker, this sort of setup seemed to happen all the time. But I looked at the solver output and I saw that it is fine. We can't replicate this exact spot because the solver wouldn't allow all those cold calls and also the straddle. But if we simulate just blind versus blind, then pocket queens are meant to get it in. But I noticed something odd in real life. Almost every time when I got my money in this scenario, I was the one having the queens and my opponent had aces. Did I really get so unlucky? And then I figured something out by analyzing the situation a bit deeper. In our example from the 1-3 live game, if our opponent had a hand like pocket jacks, he would probably not 5-bet it. I would say that he would maybe not even 5-bet all his ace-king and king combos, but maybe only a third of them. And how do you think our pocket queens fare against this new 5-betting shoving range? Well, we now have 33% equity. And if we say that he never ever shoves anything else than aces and kings, then obviously we're drawing very thinly with only about 18% equity. And that is why pocket queens are our first very dangerous hand that many players overplay. In nitty games, pocket queens are exactly the hand that gets coolered most because your opponent will just not put enough money in with weaker hands. But on to the next one. And this is quite similar, but I have the impression that many players overplay this one even more. Let's have a look at a hand that I played online where I had pocket kings. And no, pocket kings are not the hand that I mean. This time it was my villain who made that mistake. So there was an open in the low jack, I 3-bet my kings in the cutoff, and now the small blind cold 4-bets. The original raiser folds. With pocket kings, we could just call, but the best move is to just get the money in, either get called by worse or deny equity to a hand like ace-king or ace-queen. And if villain has aces, we would get it in anyway. When I'm 100 big blinds deep, I play my kings just like aces pre-flop. So I shove, and the small blind snap calls with ace-king. I looked at the solver, and even solver says that this call by villain is a mistake. You have to fold ace-king offsuit to this action even in solver land. And I imagine your mortal opponents, and not only that, but this example was for 100 big blinds, but in live poker you often have stacks of 200 big blinds or even deeper. The thing is, even if the cutoff shoves the range of queens plus an ace-king, that ace-king only has 38% equity. And quite frankly, a lot of players would just call with pocket queens and maybe even ace-king. In a moment, I'm going to show you the third dangerous hand, and that will be a very different type of hand. But first, let's discuss how to play queens and ace-king the correct way without getting stacked. It is actually very simple, but it requires discipline. Here is how I go about these hands nowadays. When I look down at queens and ace-king, I will assume that they are nutted hands straight away. I will raise any unopened pot, I will 3-bet if someone else has raised, and I will evaluate if I want to cold 4-bet if someone has raised and someone else has 3-bet. But in live low-stakes poker, I will seriously consider folding these hands to 4-bets from recreational players. The clue here is recreational players. If a reg 4-bets me, I might still fold them, but I would have to think about it. But if your average opponent who has limped all night decides to 4-bet you, then it is time to fold. But as I said, this is easier said than done once you're in the heat of the moment. You have to understand one thing though. Even if you were to fold the winning hand, which you will from time to time, this is not a disaster. People get so emotionally attached to big hands, but in reality, it doesn't matter. Move on to the next hand, accept that someone else is a better hand, or that they outplayed you. Even that is fine. Okay, but now to the last dangerous hand. As I said, this is a very different kind of hand. In fact, it's not even one specific hand, but more of a type of hand, a hand class. I asked ChatGPT what most players' favorite starting hand was. Well, it said 7 deuce offsuit, but then it also said Jack 10 suited. Apparently, players like this hand because of its strong potential for straights and flushes, and it tends to hold sentimental or intuitive value, whatever that is. It's not the most powerful hand, but many people have a good feeling about it due to its versatility. I have heard this a lot about Jack 10 suited, about 7-6 suited, about 6-5 suited, basically any suited connector. Problem is, suited connectors are not that great in reality. If we look at the expected value table for every starting hand in GTO Wizard, we can see that pretty much in any position suited connectors have an expected value of 0. So you can raise, you can call, and you can fold. It doesn't make much of a difference. But here is where most players get it wrong, in multi-way pots. The common belief is that suited connectors are great hands in multi-way pots. But the truth is that they are terrible hands in multi-way scenarios. A student of mine recently played a hand where he realized this. There was a raise and a call, so my student called 7-6 of diamonds in the small blind. The big blind also called. The flop came Queen Jack 4, all diamonds. Bingo! The original raiser Cbet, my student raised, and then the other player raised again. My student now called. On the turn and on the river, villain kept barreling. My student kept calling, although he didn't feel very comfortable with this. But he didn't flop a flush to fold to aggression. In the end, villain showed my student the bad news. He, of course, had the nut flush. And that's the problem with suited connectors. If you make a flush, you have to worry that someone else has a higher flush if a lot of money goes into the pot. If you make the lower end of the straight, you have to worry that someone else has the higher straight. And even if you have trips, Someone else will typically have a better kicker when they also make trips. If you're in the big blind and you're getting a good price to call in a multi-way pot, then it is okay to call as long as you don't play too aggressively post-flop. But if you're anywhere in the field and there is a raise and it looks likely that the pot will go multi-way, then it is best to just ditch this hand. And this is how you avoid overplaying the third dangerous poker hand. But there are a lot more mistakes that you have to avoid if you want to be a winning player at live low-stakes poker.